The galaxy existed in a state utterly alien to any consciousness that would later attempt to comprehend it. Billions of years before the first sentient thought flickered into being, the materium followed patterns dictated solely by physics and chemistry. Stars ignited from collapsing clouds of hydrogen and helium, burned through their fuel, and died in spectacular supernovae that seeded the cosmos with heavier elements. Planets coalesced from protoplanetary disks, their surfaces bombarded by asteroids and comets. No observer existed to witness these processes, no mind to interpret the dance of gravity and nuclear fusion that shaped the physical universe. The warp during this primordial epoch bore no resemblance to the nightmare realm that would come to define it in later ages. The immaterium existed as a parallel dimension, a realm of pure energy that mirrored the material universe in the most fundamental sense. Without sentient beings to generate complex emotions, thoughts, and psychic emanations, the warp remained largely quiescent. It was not empty, energy flowed through it, currents and eddies formed and dissipated, but these movements reflected only the base physical processes occurring in real space. The birth of a star might create ripples in the immaterium, the death of a world might generate disturbances, but these were simple reflections of matter and energy, devoid of meaning or intent. The barrier between the materium and immaterium existed as a natural consequence of their different states. Real space operated under consistent physical laws: gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces. The warp functioned according to principles that would later be understood as psychic or metaphysical, though these terms would have been meaningless in an era without minds to conceive them. The membrane separating these two dimensions remained stable and largely impermeable. Warp storms did not exist because there were no psychic disturbances to generate them. The immaterium simply was, a reflection in a mirror with nothing yet to reflect. This stability persisted for eons. The galaxy underwent countless transformations. Spiral arms rotated, star clusters formed and dispersed, entire stellar populations lived and died. Chemical evolution proceeded according to immutable laws. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and the other building blocks of organic chemistry accumulated in stellar nurseries and planetary systems. The conditions for life emerged not through any grand design, but through the relentless mathematics of probability operating across billions of star systems over billions of years. The first life to emerge in the galaxy consisted of simple self-replicating molecules, no different in principle from the microbial organisms that would later arise on countless worlds. These primitive forms possessed no consciousness, no awareness beyond the most basic chemical responses to their environment. They divided, mutated, competed for resources, and evolved according to the principles of natural selection. The warp registered nothing from these early life forms because they generated no psychic presence. Their existence remained confined entirely to the material realm. As life diversified and spread across suitable worlds, complexity increased through the gradual accumulation of beneficial mutations and adaptations. Multicellular organisms appeared, developing specialized tissues and organs. Nervous systems evolved to coordinate responses to environmental stimuli. Brains emerged as centralized processing centers for sensory information. Yet even these developments failed to disturb the calm of the immaterium. Instinct and reflex, however sophisticated, did not constitute consciousness in the sense that would later prove so consequential. The critical threshold came with the emergence of true sentience, self-awareness, abstract thought, the ability to conceive of oneself as distinct from the environment. This represented a fundamental shift in the nature of life in the galaxy. For the first time, beings existed that could reflect upon their own existence, that could imagine futures and remember pasts, that could experience emotions beyond simple stimulus response patterns. The exact mechanisms that enabled this transition from complex neural processing to genuine consciousness remain subjects of speculation, but the effects on the warp were immediate and profound. Sentient thought created new patterns in the immaterium, where previously only the dull echoes of physical processes had disturbed the warp. Now psychic emanations of an entirely different character began to manifest. Fear, curiosity, satisfaction, frustration, These emotions generated corresponding energies in the immaterium. The warp began to develop structure and complexity that mirrored the mental states of sentient beings. This was not yet the roiling chaos that would characterize later ages, but it marked the beginning of a new relationship between the material and immaterial realms. The Old Ones were not the first sentient species to evolve in the galaxy, though they would become by far the most significant. Evidence suggests that other intelligent races emerged during the galaxy's deep history, though their names and achievements have been lost to the passage of millions of years. What distinguished the Old Ones from these earlier species was not merely their intelligence, but their unique relationship with the warp. Where other sentient beings generated psychic emanations as an unavoidable consequence of consciousness, the Old Ones developed the ability to perceive and manipulate these energies deliberately. The exact nature of the Old Ones' homeworld and the environmental pressures that shaped their evolution remain unknown. What can be inferred from their later capabilities suggests a species that evolved in conditions favorable to the development of psychic sensitivity. Their biology incorporated structures that allowed them to sense and interact with warp energy in ways that other species could not. This was not magic or supernatural ability, but rather an additional sense, analogous to how some organisms can perceive electromagnetic fields or ultrasonic frequencies imperceptible to others. The early warp, even after the emergence of sentient life, remained vastly different from the nightmare realm it would become. The chaos gods did not exist. The immaterium contained no entities of significant power or consciousness. The psychic emanations of scattered sentient species created localized patterns and currents, but these lacked the coherence and intensity to coalesce into independent warp entities. A being traveling through the immaterium during this era would have experienced a realm of shifting energies and half-formed impressions, reflecting the thoughts and emotions of distant minds, but possessing no agency or intent of its own. The relationship between real space and the warp during this primordial period functioned according to principles that would later be disrupted beyond recognition. Psychic energy flowed from the material realm into the immaterium, where it dissipated gradually, returning to an undifferentiated state. The barrier between dimensions remained robust and stable. Warp entities could not manifest in real space because no such entities existed. Demons, the crystallized embodiments of specific emotions and concepts, had no template from which to form. The immaterium served as a repository for psychic energy, but not as a realm of independent existence. Natural laws governed both realms with consistent predictability. In the materium, physics operated without exception or violation. In the immaterium, psychic energies followed their own patterns, shaped by the mental states that generated them but not subject to conscious will except in the most rudimentary ways. The Old Ones' ancestors, like all sentient beings of that era, lived primarily in real space, their psychic presence in the warp an unconscious byproduct of their existence rather than a tool they could deliberately employ. The cosmological conditions that enabled the Old Ones' rise involved both their innate capabilities and the state of the galaxy itself. Sentient life remained relatively sparse, scattered across vast distances with no means of communication or interaction between species. Each world with intelligent inhabitants existed in isolation, unaware of others facing similar evolutionary pressures. The Old Ones emerged during this era of separation and silence, their unique psychic sensitivity positioning them to eventually transcend the limitations that confined other species to their homeworlds. The immaterium's undifferentiated nature meant that psychic abilities, where they existed, remained weak and unreliable. The Old Ones' early experiments with warp manipulation would have yielded inconsistent results, their efforts to shape psychic energy hampered by the lack of established patterns or structures in the immaterium. Yet this very absence of complexity also meant an absence of danger. The warp contained no predatory entities, no malevolent forces waiting to exploit psychic contact. The Old Ones could explore and experiment with relative safety, gradually developing techniques and understanding that would eventually allow them to reshape both realms according to their will. The homeworld of the Old Ones has been lost to history with such completeness that not even its name survives in the fragmentary records that persist into the 41st millennium. The war in heaven obliterated entire regions of space, and the cataclysmic energies unleashed during that conflict rewrote the fundamental structure of the galaxy. Scholars of the Eldar, whose species memory extends further back than any other surviving race, possess only the vaguest impressions of where the Old Ones first arose. The location might have been in what is now the Eastern Fringe, or perhaps in regions that no longer exist in any recognizable form, consumed by warp storms or stellar phenomena that emerged as consequences of ancient weapons. The star system itself, whether it orbited a yellow dwarf similar to Terra's sun or existed in some more exotic stellar environment, remains unknown. What can be stated with certainty is that the Old One's place of origin was thoroughly destroyed during the final stages of the war in heaven, either by the Khatan and their Necrontyr servants, or by the catastrophic warp rifts that tore through real space as the conflict reached its apocalyptic conclusion. The biological nature of the Old Ones presents significant challenges to reconstruction. Unlike the Necrontyr, who left behind their transformed bodies as the Necrons, or the Eldar, who survived to preserve knowledge of their creators, the Old Ones themselves vanished completely. No fossils exist, no genetic material remains for analysis, no physical artifacts bear their actual forms. What information survives comes primarily from the psychic impressions embedded in ancient Eldar constructs and the fragmentary data engrams that occasionally surface from Necron tomb worlds. These sources suggest that the Old Ones possessed amphibian characteristics, though the specifics of their morphology remain speculative. They were not humanoid in the sense that later races would understand the term, and their physiology reflected adaptations to environmental conditions fundamentally different from those that shaped humanity or most other species. The evolutionary pathway that led to the Old Ones developing their extraordinary capabilities involved biological structures that other species simply did not possess. Their nervous systems incorporated organs capable of directly perceiving warp energy, analogous to how certain organisms on ancient Terra could sense magnetic fields or detect infrared radiation. These structures were not separate from their physical brains, but integrated throughout their bodies, creating a distributed psychic sensory network. This biological architecture meant that the Old Ones experienced reality as a fusion of material and immaterial perceptions from the earliest stages of their evolution. They did not learn to sense the warp as a separate skill. Rather, their species never experienced existence without this additional dimension of perception. The development of these psychic organs occurred over millions of years through conventional evolutionary processes. The Old One's homeworld must have possessed characteristics that made psychic sensitivity advantageous for survival. Perhaps the planet experienced unusual interactions between real space and the warp, creating environmental pressures that rewarded organisms capable of detecting immaterial threats or opportunities. Perhaps their ecosystem included predators or prey that generated significant psychic emanations, making the ability to sense these energies crucial for hunting or avoiding being hunted. The exact selective pressures remain unknown, but their effects produced a species whose biology was fundamentally intertwined with both realms of existence. As the Old Ones evolved true sentience, their innate psychic sensitivity provided capabilities that other intelligent species lacked. They could perceive the psychic emanations of other conscious beings, sensing emotions and intentions without verbal communication. They could detect disturbances in the warp caused by distant events, gaining information about their environment that physical senses alone could never provide. Most significantly, they discovered that they could manipulate warp energy through focused mental effort, shaping psychic currents in ways that produced effects in the material realm. These early manipulations were crude and limited, but they demonstrated a principle that would define the Old One's entire civilization. The barrier between materium and immaterium was not absolute but permeable to those with the biological capability to bridge it. The natural affinity the Old Ones possessed for warp manipulation came without the corruption that would plague every subsequent psychic race. This immunity resulted from the state of the immaterium during their emergence. The warp contained no chaos gods, no demons, no predatory entities seeking to exploit psychic contact. The energies the Old Ones manipulated were raw and undifferentiated, lacking the taint of malevolence or corruption that would later characterize warp exposure. Their biology adapted to interact with this pristine immaterium, developing natural safeguards and filters that protected their consciousness from the harmful effects of psychic energy. These protections were not consciously designed, but evolved as part of their species' natural development, much as organisms develop immune systems to protect against biological threats. The Old Ones' psychic abilities operated through principles that later races would struggle to comprehend or replicate. They did not impose their will upon the warp through force or domination, but rather worked in harmony with its natural currents and patterns. Their manipulations resembled skilled navigation more than brute compulsion, guiding and shaping existing energies rather than attempting to create entirely new ones. This approach proved both more efficient and more stable than the psychic techniques that later species would develop. The Old Ones could achieve effects that would require immense effort from younger races while expending relatively little of their own psychic strength. The transition from a species confined to a single world to an interstellar civilization required overcoming the fundamental limitation that trapped other intelligent races: the vast distances between star systems. Conventional propulsion methods, even those approaching relativistic speeds, made interstellar travel impractical for biological organisms with finite lifespans. The Old Ones solved this problem through their mastery of the warp. They discovered that the immaterium existed outside normal spacetime, that distances in the warp bore no direct relationship to distances in real space. A journey that would require thousands of years at sublight speeds could be accomplished in a fraction of that time by traveling through the immaterium. The development of warp-based faster-than-light travel represented the single most significant technological achievement in galactic history. The Old Ones did not build mechanical devices to pierce the barrier between realms. Instead, they used their psychic abilities to open controlled passages between the materium and immaterium. These early warp transitions were small-scale affairs, probably limited to moving individual Old Ones or small groups across interstellar distances. The process required enormous psychic effort and carried risks even in the relatively calm immaterium of that era. Miscalculations could result in emergence points far from intended destinations, or worse, leave travelers stranded in the warp without means of returning to real space. The establishment of the Old Ones' first interstellar colonies proceeded gradually over thousands of years. Each successful warp journey provided data that improved subsequent attempts. The Old Ones mapped the relationship between real space locations and their corresponding positions in the immaterium, identifying routes through the warp that proved more stable and reliable than others. They developed techniques for maintaining coherent consciousness during warp transit, preventing the disorientation and psychological damage that unprotected exposure to the immaterium could cause. Most importantly, they learned to create permanent or semi-permanent passages between specific locations, the precursors to the webway that would later become their greatest achievement. These early interstellar settlements revealed that the Old Ones were not alone in the galaxy. Other intelligent species existed, scattered across thousands of star systems, each confined to their homeworlds by the tyranny of distance. Most of these species possessed no psychic abilities whatsoever, their evolution having followed pathways that prioritized different adaptations. They had developed sophisticated technologies within the constraints of real space physics, but none had achieved the breakthrough that would enable them to spread beyond their native systems. The Old Ones' arrival introduced these isolated civilizations to possibilities they had never imagined. The Old Ones' approach to these younger species varied based on circumstances and the characteristics of each race. They were not conquerors in the conventional sense, having no interest in subjugating other civilizations or exploiting their resources. Their needs and capabilities existed on a scale that made such concerns irrelevant. Instead, the Old Ones positioned themselves as teachers and guides, sharing knowledge that elevated primitive species toward greater sophistication. This mentoring relationship would define the Old Ones' role in the galaxy for millions of years, though the motivations behind their generosity remain subject to interpretation. Whether they acted from genuine benevolence, strategic calculation, or simple curiosity cannot be determined from available evidence. The psychic mastery that enabled the Old Ones' expansion also allowed them to extend their lifespans far beyond biological norms. They discovered techniques for using warp energy to repair cellular damage, halt aging processes, and even regenerate injured tissues. Individual Old Ones could potentially live for thousands or tens of thousands of years, accumulating knowledge and experience across timeframes that would encompass the entire recorded history of younger races. This longevity meant that the Old Ones who first ventured beyond their homeworld might still have been alive millions of years later when the Necrontyr made contact, creating a continuity of memory and purpose that no other species could match. The civilization that emerged from these early expansions bore little resemblance to the empires and kingdoms that later species would construct. The Old Ones did not build cities in the conventional sense, did not establish governments or bureaucracies, did not engage in the economic competition that characterized younger races. Their society functioned according to principles shaped by their psychic interconnection and their fundamentally different relationship with reality. Information and knowledge flowed between individuals through psychic communion rather than verbal communication. Decisions emerged from consensus, achieved through direct mind-to-mind contact rather than debate or voting. The entire species operated with a degree of coordination and shared purpose that would be impossible for non-psychic races. The Old Ones' understanding of life transcended anything that later civilizations would achieve, even at the height of their power. Where the Adeptus Mechanicus of the 41st millennium treats biology as machinery to be cataloged and maintained, and where the homunculi of Camorra torture flesh into new configurations through pain and suffering, the Old Ones perceived life as a unified phenomenon spanning both the material and immaterial realms simultaneously. Their psychic senses allowed them to observe how genetic structures in real space corresponded to patterns in the warp, how the soul of an organism connected to its physical form through mechanisms that operated across dimensional boundaries. This dual perception meant that when the Old Ones manipulated genetic material, they were not simply rearranging molecules according to biochemical principles. They simultaneously shaped the psychic resonance that every living thing generated, crafting organisms whose physical and spiritual components existed in perfect harmony. The techniques the Old Ones developed for genetic manipulation operated on scales both vast and infinitesimal. At the molecular level, they could restructure DNA with precision that made later genetic engineering look like crude butchery. They understood how specific gene sequences produced not just physical traits, but also psychic characteristics, how certain proteins affected an organism's ability to perceive or generate warp energy, how the architecture of neural tissue determined the shape and strength of a creature's presence in the immaterium. This knowledge allowed them to design organisms from the ground up, specifying every aspect of their biology and their psychic nature with absolute control. The Old Ones did not experiment through trial and error, generating countless failed mutations before achieving desired results. They calculated outcomes with mathematical certainty, their understanding of life's principles so complete that they could predict exactly how genetic modifications would manifest across generations. The bioengineering laboratories where the Old Ones conducted their work bore no resemblance to the sterile facilities that later species would construct. The Old Ones did not require physical equipment to manipulate genetic material because they could interact directly with living tissue through their psychic abilities. A single Old One, focusing their consciousness on a developing embryo, could guide cellular differentiation and organ formation in real time, correcting errors and introducing modifications as the organism grew. This hands-on approach meant that each creation received individual attention during its development, with the Old Ones monitoring and adjusting the process until the organism reached maturity. The time investment for creating a single individual of a new species might span years or decades, but the Old Ones' extended lifespans made such commitments trivial. The process of seeding worlds with life required capabilities that extended far beyond genetic manipulation alone. The Old Ones needed to understand planetary ecosystems as complete systems, recognizing how countless species would interact with each other and their environment across millions of years of evolution. They surveyed potential worlds with thoroughness that encompassed both physical and psychic characteristics. The chemical composition of the atmosphere, the intensity of stellar radiation, the presence of liquid water, the strength of the magnetic field, all these factors received analysis. Simultaneously, the Old Ones examined each world's psychic resonance, determining how the planet's presence in the warp would affect organisms living on its surface. Some worlds possessed natural psychic dampening effects that would inhibit the development of warp-sensitive species. Others showed unusual permeability between realms that might prove either advantageous or dangerous depending on circumstances. Once the Old Ones selected a suitable world, they began the terraforming process through methods that combined conventional physics with warp manipulation. They could alter atmospheric composition by introducing engineered microorganisms that consumed certain gases and produced others. They could modify surface temperature by adjusting a planet's orbital characteristics through gravitational manipulation, techniques that required psychic abilities to coordinate forces across astronomical distances. They could seed oceans with the chemical precursors necessary for life to emerge and evolve. The timescales involved in these transformations varied enormously depending on the initial state of each world. A planet that already possessed liquid water and a stable atmosphere might require only centuries of preparation. A barren rock with no atmosphere at all might demand millions of years of patient work before it could support even the simplest organisms. The Old Ones did not simply introduce random microbes to newly prepared worlds and allow evolution to proceed without guidance. They seeded each planet with carefully designed foundation species, organisms whose genetic structure contained latent potential for diversification along specific evolutionary pathways. These foundation species were not complete in themselves, but rather starting points, templates that would generate variation through natural mutation and selection, while remaining within parameters the Old Ones had established. A single foundation species might give rise to thousands or millions of descendant forms over geological timescales, each adapted to different ecological niches, but all sharing fundamental characteristics that the Old Ones had built into the original genetic structure. The guidance the Old Ones provided to evolutionary processes operated through mechanisms both subtle and overt. They monitored developing ecosystems across thousands of years, observing how their foundation species diversified and adapted to changing conditions. When evolution produced outcomes that aligned with the Old Ones' intentions, they allowed natural selection to proceed without interference. When species evolved in directions that would destabilize the ecosystem or prevent the emergence of desired traits, the Old Ones intervened directly. These interventions might involve introducing new genetic variations into breeding populations, eliminating species that threatened to dominate their environments too completely, or modifying planetary conditions to create new selective pressures. The Old Ones functioned as gardeners tending plots across millions of years, their patience and longevity allowing them to pursue projects that would span hundreds of generations for shorter-lived species. The philosophy that governed the Old Ones' approach to creating and guiding life reflected their fundamental nature as beings who existed simultaneously in the material and immaterial realms. They did not view themselves as gods, despite possessing capabilities that would seem godlike to lesser species. The Old Ones understood that they were products of natural processes, that their abilities resulted from evolutionary adaptations rather than supernatural origins. This perspective informed their relationship with the life they created. They were not divine creators imposing their will upon helpless subjects, but rather skilled practitioners working with the fundamental principles that governed biological and psychic existence. The distinction might seem subtle, but it profoundly affected how the Old Ones conducted their work and how they related to the species they uplifted. The Old Ones saw themselves as gardeners rather than conquerors, a metaphor that captures essential aspects of their civilization's character. Gardeners do not dominate their gardens through force. They work with natural growth patterns, providing conditions that allow plants to flourish while preventing any single species from overwhelming others. They cultivate diversity because they understand that complex ecosystems prove more stable and resilient than monocultures. They plan across seasons and years, accepting that meaningful results require patience and sustained effort. The Old Ones applied these same principles to their stewardship of the galaxy, seeding thousands of worlds with life and guiding the evolution of countless species toward outcomes they deemed beneficial. The ethical framework that governed the Old Ones' decisions about which worlds to terraform and which species to create or uplift remains difficult to reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. The Eldar preserve impressions that suggest the Old Ones operated according to principles that valued diversity, stability, and the cultivation of psychic potential. They preferred to work with existing life where possible, uplifting species that showed promise rather than replacing them with entirely new creations. They avoided creating species whose nature would inherently lead to conflict or suffering, though their ability to predict long-term outcomes was not infallible. The Old Ones made choices based on timescales that encompassed millions of years, accepting that individual suffering or extinction events might occur as part of larger patterns they considered acceptable. The question of whether the Old Ones possessed genuine moral consideration for the species they created or merely pursued their own inscrutable goals cannot be answered definitively. Evidence suggests they were not cruel or callous in their treatment of younger races. They provided knowledge and assistance to species they uplifted, teaching them techniques for survival and advancement. They protected developing civilizations from threats those species could not face alone. Yet the Old Ones also clearly pursued specific objectives through their bioengineering work, creating species with characteristics that served purposes beyond simply allowing those species to flourish. The Eldar were crafted to be psychically potent, capable of perceiving and manipulating warp energy in ways that would make them valuable allies or servants. The Jakaro received instinctive understanding of technology that allowed them to construct sophisticated devices without comprehending the principles behind their creations. The Krork, who would degenerate into the Orcs after the Old Ones' fall, were designed as warriors capable of fighting the Necrons and their Khatan masters. The Old Ones' ability to craft life at both the molecular and spiritual levels simultaneously enabled them to create species with characteristics that would be impossible through conventional evolution. They could design organisms whose psychic presence in the warp bore little relationship to their physical size or complexity. They could create beings whose souls possessed specific structures that made them resistant to corruption or particularly adept at certain types of warp manipulation. They could engineer species whose members maintained psychic connections to each other across vast distances, allowing for coordination and communication that transcended normal limitations. These capabilities meant that the Old Ones could tailor each species to fulfill specific roles within the larger galactic ecosystem they were cultivating. The relationship between the Old Ones and the species they created varied considerably depending on each race's characteristics and the purposes for which they were designed. Some species received extensive direct guidance, with the Old Ones maintaining active presence in their civilizations for thousands of years, teaching and advising as the younger races developed their own cultures and technologies. Other species were given their initial genetic structure and then left largely alone, allowed to evolve and develop without constant supervision. The Old Ones did not seek to control every aspect of their creation's existence, but rather established initial conditions and occasionally intervened to prevent catastrophic failures or guide development back toward desired pathways. The scale of the Old Ones' bioengineering projects defied comprehension. They seeded not dozens or hundreds, but thousands of worlds with life, creating ecosystems of staggering complexity on planets scattered throughout the galaxy. Each world received attention appropriate to its characteristics and potential, with the Old Ones investing more effort in systems that showed particular promise for developing advanced life. The cumulative effect of these efforts transformed the galaxy from a realm where life existed only on scattered worlds that happened to possess suitable conditions into a place where living worlds became common, where complex ecosystems flourished on planets that would have remained barren without intervention. The techniques the Old Ones developed for accelerating evolutionary processes allowed them to compress timescales that would normally require millions of years into mere thousands. They could introduce targeted mutations that would take countless generations to appear through random chance, then create environmental pressures that selected for those specific traits. They could isolate populations to prevent genetic drift from diluting desired characteristics, then reintroduce diversity at appropriate times to prevent inbreeding depression. They could simulate the effects of natural selection through controlled breeding programs that produced results identical to those that would emerge from environmental pressures operating over geological timescales. These techniques required both profound understanding of genetics and the psychic abilities necessary to monitor and manipulate living organisms across planetary populations. The Old Ones' mastery extended to creating species capable of surviving in environments that would be lethal to most life forms. They engineered organisms that could metabolize exotic chemicals, withstand extreme radiation, function in vacuum or crushing atmospheric pressure, and adapt to temperature ranges that would destroy conventional biological molecules. These extremophile species served various purposes in the Old Ones' plans, from terraforming hostile worlds to serving as biological sensors in environments too dangerous for direct observation. The Old Ones understood that life's potential extended far beyond the narrow range of conditions that existed on their homeworld, and they explored that potential through countless experiments and creations. The conception of the webway emerged from a fundamental problem that plagued the Old Ones despite their mastery of warp travel. Direct transit through the immaterium, even during the relatively calm epoch before the war in heaven, carried inherent limitations and dangers that became increasingly apparent as their civilization expanded across the galaxy. Each journey through the raw warp required enormous psychic effort to maintain coherent consciousness and navigate to the intended destination. The immaterium's non-Euclidean geometry meant that routes between the same 2 points might vary dramatically in length and difficulty, depending on unpredictable fluctuations in warp currents. More concerning, the Old Ones recognized that the immaterium was changing as sentient life proliferated throughout the galaxy. The psychic emanations from billions of conscious beings were beginning to create more complex patterns in the warp, structures that hinted at future dangers, even though the Chaos Gods had not yet coalesced into existence. The Old Ones needed a solution that would preserve the advantages of warp-based travel while eliminating its unpredictability and the psychic strain it imposed. They envisioned a network of stable passages that would exist within the immaterium, but remain isolated from its chaotic nature, protected corridors that would allow movement between distant locations without direct exposure to the warp's raw energies. This concept represented an engineering challenge of unprecedented magnitude. The Old Ones would need to create permanent structures within a realm where conventional matter could not exist, where the normal laws of physics held no authority, where everything existed in a state of constant flux shaped by psychic forces rather than material constraints. The initial construction of what would become the webway began with small-scale experiments that tested whether stable structures could exist within the immaterium at all. The Old Ones discovered that they could create bubbles of stabilized space within the warp by generating psychic fields that imposed order on the surrounding chaos. These fields functioned as barriers that prevented warp energies from penetrating into the protected space, creating pockets where the laws of real space could be maintained despite existing within the immaterium. The earliest such bubbles were tiny, barely large enough to contain a single Old One, and maintaining them required constant psychic effort. They collapsed immediately when the Old One generating the stabilization field ceased their concentration, demonstrating that temporary solutions would not suffice for the permanent infrastructure the Old Ones envisioned. The breakthrough came when the Old Ones learned to anchor their stabilization fields to the barrier between the materium and immaterium itself. This barrier, the fundamental membrane separating the two realms, possessed inherent stability that the Old Ones could exploit. By threading their psychic constructs through this dimensional interface, they created structures that drew upon the barrier's natural resistance to penetration. These anchored fields proved far more stable than free-floating bubbles, maintaining their integrity without requiring constant psychic maintenance. The Old Ones had discovered the principle that would enable the webway's construction. They could create tunnels that existed technically within the immaterium, but remained fundamentally separate from it, passages that touched the warp without being consumed by it. The engineering principles underlying the webway's construction combined psychic architecture with an understanding of dimensional physics that no later civilization would fully replicate. The Old Ones did not build the webway from physical materials because conventional matter would either dissolve in the warp or require impossible amounts of energy to maintain coherence within the immaterium. Instead, they wove the tunnels from solidified psychic energy, using techniques that transformed ephemeral warp currents into permanent structures. This process resembled crystallization more than conventional construction, with the Old Ones seeding specific locations in the warp with psychic patterns that attracted and organized surrounding energies into stable configurations. These seed patterns grew over time, extending through the immaterium along pathways the Old Ones defined, gradually forming tunnels that connected predetermined endpoints in real space. The walls of webway passages consisted of multiple layers of psychic barriers, each serving specific functions. The innermost layer maintained real space physics within the tunnel, allowing beings and objects to exist in stable forms despite their location within the immaterium. The middle layers provided structural integrity, preventing the tunnel from collapsing under the pressure of surrounding warp energies that constantly sought to intrude into the protected space. The outermost layers served as sensors and filters, monitoring conditions in the adjacent warp and adjusting the barrier's strength to compensate for fluctuations in local psychic activity. This multi-layered architecture gave webway passages remarkable resilience, allowing them to withstand disturbances that would destroy simpler constructs. The creation of each webway tunnel required multiple Old Ones working in coordination across extended periods. The process began with careful surveys of both real space and the immaterium, identifying optimal routes between the locations the Old Ones wished to connect. These routes needed to minimize distance through the warp while avoiding regions where psychic turbulence made stable construction difficult or impossible. Once a route was selected, the Old Ones positioned themselves at key points along its length, both in real space and within the immaterium itself. They synchronized their psychic efforts, generating the seed patterns simultaneously at multiple locations so that the growing tunnel sections would meet and merge correctly. Errors in coordination could result in misaligned segments that failed to connect, wasting years of effort and requiring the entire process to begin again. The expansion of the webway across the galaxy proceeded gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. The Old Ones began by connecting their most important worlds, establishing primary routes between major centers of their civilization. These initial tunnels served as trunk lines from which secondary passages could branch, creating a hierarchical network structure that prioritized the most critical connections while still providing access to less significant locations. As the webway grew, the Old Ones refined their construction techniques, learning to create tunnels more quickly and with greater stability. They developed standardized junction designs where multiple passages intersected, allowing travelers to change routes without returning to real space. They created rest stations within the webway itself, pocket dimensions where beings could pause during long journeys without the psychic strain of maintaining consciousness in the raw warp. The strategic significance of the webway to Old One civilization cannot be overstated. The network transformed their empire from a collection of scattered worlds connected by difficult and dangerous warp travel into an integrated whole where any location could be reached from any other with relative ease and safety. Travel times between distant systems dropped from months or years to days or weeks, depending on the specific route and distance involved. The elimination of direct warp exposure meant that even beings with minimal psychic abilities could traverse the webway safely, opening interstellar travel to species that the Old Ones had uplifted, but who lacked the psychic strength to survive unprotected transit through the immaterium. The webway enabled the Old Ones to coordinate their activities across the entire galaxy, responding to threats or opportunities anywhere within their domain without the delays that would cripple less advanced civilizations. The military advantages the webway provided proved crucial during the war in Heaven. The Old Ones could move their forces rapidly between battlefronts, concentrating overwhelming strength against isolated Necron forces before those enemies could receive reinforcements. They could retreat through webway portals when faced with superior numbers, denying the Necrons the decisive battles that might have ended the war more quickly. They could strike at Necron tomb worlds and then vanish back into the webway before the Catan could respond, conducting hit-and-run operations that gradually wore down their enemies despite the Necrons' technological superiority in direct combat. The Necrons and their Catan masters recognized the webway as a critical strategic asset and devoted enormous effort to finding ways to breach or destroy it, though their success in these attempts remained limited throughout most of the conflict. The cultural significance of the webway extended beyond its practical utility. The network represented the ultimate expression of the Old Ones' mastery over both the material and immaterial realms, a testament to their ability to reshape reality according to their will. Where other species remained confined by the limitations of conventional physics, the Old Ones had created infrastructure that transcended dimensional boundaries, turning the immaterium itself into a resource they could exploit. The webway demonstrated principles that defined the Old Ones' entire approach to existence. They did not accept reality as given, but rather modified it to suit their needs. They thought in terms of millions of years rather than generations, and they created works intended to endure long after their own civilization had passed. The maintenance requirements for the webway necessitated constant attention from psychically gifted individuals who could perceive and repair damage to the tunnel's structure. The barriers separating webway passages from the surrounding warp experienced continuous stress from the immaterium's chaotic energies. Localized disturbances in the warp could weaken sections of tunnel, creating thin spots where warp energy might begin seeping through the barriers. More serious damage could result from violent psychic events in nearby real space, such as the death of particularly powerful psychers or catastrophic warp storms. The Old Ones established monitoring systems throughout the webway that alerted maintenance teams to problems requiring intervention, allowing them to repair damage before it could compromise entire sections of the network. The webway's architecture incorporated features that later civilizations would struggle to understand or replicate. The tunnels did not simply connect two points through the shortest possible route, but instead followed pathways that optimized for stability rather than distance. Some routes curved through higher dimensions that existed beyond normal three-dimensional space, allowing them to connect locations that should have been impossibly far apart based on real space geometry. Other passages incorporated temporal elements, though not in the sense of time travel as such. Rather, these sections existed in states where time flowed at different rates relative to real space, allowing travelers to cover vast distances while experiencing only brief subjective journey times. The Old Ones built these sophisticated features into the webway's fundamental structure, making them intrinsic properties of the network rather than systems that required active management. The junction points where multiple webway tunnels intersected became significant locations in their own right. The Old Ones constructed installations at major junctions that served as waypoints, trading posts, and defensive strongholds. These junction stations existed entirely within the webway pocket dimensions that maintained real space physics, but had no direct connection to the material universe except through the tunnels that met there. Some junction stations grew to enormous size, becoming cities in their own right where thousands of beings lived and worked without ever setting foot in real space. The Old Ones used these stations as administrative centers for managing different regions of their empire, as research facilities where they could conduct experiments requiring isolation from both real space and the raw warp, and as fortresses that could be defended even if the surrounding regions of the galaxy fell to enemy control. The webway's expansion eventually encompassed thousands of worlds, connecting not just the Old One's own territories, but also the homeworlds of species they had uplifted and guided. The network became the galaxy's circulatory system, enabling the flow of knowledge, resources, and populations across distances that would otherwise have isolated civilizations from each other. Species that the Old Ones had seeded on distant worlds could maintain contact with their distant relatives, preventing the genetic and cultural drift that would normally result from separation across interstellar distances. The webway facilitated the spread of innovations and discoveries, allowing breakthroughs achieved on one world to benefit inhabitants of thousands of others. The network created a level of galactic integration that would never be matched after the Old One's fall, transforming isolated pockets of civilization into a unified community spanning the entire galaxy. The Old Ones perceived the Immaterium not as a separate dimension to be feared or conquered, but as a complementary aspect of existence that interpenetrated with material reality at every level. Their understanding began with direct observation through their psychically attuned biology, which allowed them to sense warp currents and eddies as naturally as other species perceived light or sound. Where younger races would later develop crude metaphors comparing the warp to an ocean or a storm, the Old Ones experienced it as a realm governed by consistent principles that could be studied, understood, and ultimately manipulated with precision. They recognized that the Immaterium functioned as a reflection of consciousness itself, a domain where thoughts and emotions possessed substance and could interact according to rules fundamentally different from physical laws, yet no less predictable to those with proper comprehension. The psychic emanations that sentient beings generated formed the basic building blocks of warp phenomena as the Old Ones understood them. Each conscious thought created ripples in the Immaterium, patterns of energy that corresponded to the nature and intensity of that thought. Simple emotions produced straightforward warp signatures. Fear generated one type of disturbance, joy another, anger a third. More complex mental states created correspondingly intricate patterns, with abstract reasoning and philosophical contemplation producing warp structures of remarkable sophistication. The Old Ones observed that these emanations did not simply dissipate randomly, but instead accumulated in regions of the Immaterium that corresponded to their source locations in real space. A world populated by billions of sentient beings generated a persistent presence in the warp, a psychic reflection of that planet's collective consciousness that could be detected across vast distances. The relationship between individual consciousness and collective psychic phenomena represented a crucial element of Old One understanding. They recognized that while each sentient being contributed their own emanations to the warp, these individual contributions combined and interacted in ways that produced emergent effects exceeding the sum of their parts. A civilization experiencing widespread fear during a crisis would generate warp disturbances qualitatively different from the simple addition of millions of individual fearful thoughts. The collective emotional state created resonance patterns that amplified and transformed the basic psychic signatures, producing warp phenomena with characteristics that no single mind could generate alone. The Old Ones studied these emergent effects with particular attention because they represented both opportunities for sophisticated warp manipulation and potential dangers if negative emotions achieved sufficient concentration and coherence. The Old Ones developed techniques for navigating the Immaterium that exploited their understanding of its fundamental nature, rather than attempting to impose order through brute psychic force. They recognized that warp currents flowed according to patterns determined by the distribution and mental states of sentient populations throughout the galaxy. Regions of real space with dense concentrations of life generated corresponding areas of turbulence in the Immaterium, while empty voids between star systems corresponded to calmer warp zones. The Old Ones mapped these patterns with meticulous care, identifying routes through the immaterium that remained relatively stable across extended periods. Their navigation methods resembled sailing more than conventional travel, using existing currents to facilitate movement rather than fighting against them, adjusting course to avoid regions where psychic turbulence made transit dangerous or unpredictable. The protective measures the Old Ones employed during warp travel operated through principles of psychic discipline and mental fortification rather than physical shielding. They trained their consciousness to maintain coherent structure when exposed to the immaterium's chaotic energies, developing meditation techniques that allowed them to observe warp phenomena without being overwhelmed by the sensory input. The Old Ones understood that the primary danger of warp exposure came not from direct harm to physical bodies, but from psychological dissolution, the risk that consciousness might fragment or be absorbed into surrounding psychic currents. They countered this threat by cultivating mental architectures of exceptional stability, thought patterns so deeply ingrained that they persisted even under extreme psychic pressure. An Old One entering the warp maintained their sense of self through disciplined focus on core aspects of their identity, using these anchors to resist the immaterium's tendency to blur boundaries between individual minds. The Old One's role as the first true psychers in galactic history established precedents that would echo through every subsequent civilization that developed psychic abilities. They were the first to systematically study how consciousness could manipulate warp energy, the first to develop formal techniques for channeling psychic power towards specific effects, the first to recognize that untrained psychic ability posed dangers both to the psyker and those around them. The disciplines they created emphasized control and precision over raw power, teaching that effective warp manipulation required understanding the relationship between mental states and their corresponding effects in the immaterium. An Old One learning to use their psychic abilities would spend decades or centuries mastering basic exercises designed to develop fine control, practicing techniques for generating specific warp patterns through focused thought until these manipulations became as natural as physical movement. The principles of psychic discipline that the Old Ones established centered on the concept of harmonious interaction with the warp rather than domination of it. They taught that attempting to force the immaterium to behave according to a psyker's will inevitably produce instability and backlash, that warp energy resisted compulsion in ways that made brute force approaches inefficient and dangerous. Instead, the Old Ones advocated working with the warp's natural tendencies, shaping existing currents rather than trying to create entirely new ones, guiding psychic phenomena along pathways they would naturally follow rather than forcing them into unnatural configurations. This philosophy reflected their understanding that the immaterium possessed its own internal logic, that warp phenomena followed patterns determined by the collective consciousness of all sentient beings, rather than being infinitely malleable to individual will. The Old Ones recognized early in their development that concentrated negative emotions created particularly dangerous conditions in the immaterium. They observed that fear, hatred, rage, and despair generated warp disturbances of greater intensity and persistence than positive emotions of equivalent strength. This asymmetry concerned them because it suggested that the immaterium naturally amplified negativity, that the warp itself might possess characteristics that made it inherently hostile to conscious life. The Old Ones conducted extensive research into this phenomenon, attempting to determine whether the apparent bias toward negative emotions represented a fundamental property of the immaterium or merely a consequence of how sentient beings experienced existence. Their conclusions remain uncertain based on available evidence, but they clearly understood that allowing negative emotions to accumulate in specific regions of the warp-created conditions that could persist long after the original sources of those emotions had ceased. The question of whether the Old Ones anticipated the eventual emergence of the Chaos Gods represents one of the most significant uncertainties in reconstructing their understanding of the warp. Evidence suggests they recognized that sufficiently intense and concentrated psychic emanations could create persistent structures in the immaterium semi-stable patterns that maintained coherence across extended periods. They observed the formation of minor warp entities, ephemeral constructs that emerged from localized emotional events and dissipated after brief existences. The Old Ones understood that these entities represented crystallized emotions given temporary independence, fragments of consciousness that had achieved sufficient complexity to act with apparent autonomy despite lacking true sentience. Whether they extrapolated from these observations to predict that galaxies spanning concentrations of specific emotions might eventually coalesce into entities of godlike power remains unclear. The Old Ones' awareness of potential warp dangers influenced their approach to seeding life throughout the galaxy and uplifting younger species. They preferentially created and guided civilizations whose natural psychology emphasized stability and cooperation over conflict and aggression, recognizing that species prone to violence and hatred would generate correspondingly destructive warp emanations. The psychic training they provided to uplifted races always included extensive instruction on emotional discipline and mental hygiene, teaching these younger species to recognize and manage psychological states that produced dangerous warp signatures. The Old Ones emphasized that psychic ability carried responsibilities extending beyond the individual psyche, that uncontrolled emotions could create threats affecting entire populations through their effects on the immaterium. The techniques the Old Ones developed for shaping the immaterium operated across scales ranging from individual manipulation to civilization-wide projects. At the personal level, an Old One could generate localized warp effects through focused concentration, creating phenomena that manifested in real space as telekinesis, telepathy, precognition, or other abilities that later species would categorize as psychic powers. These individual manipulations required the psyker to establish resonance between their mental state and the desired effect, generating specific thought patterns that naturally produced corresponding warp structures. The Old Ones did not force reality to conform to their wishes, but rather aligned their consciousness with warp currents that would produce the outcomes they sought, allowing the immaterium's natural processes to manifest their intentions in the material realm. Larger-scale warp manipulation required coordination between multiple Old Ones working in concert, their combined psychic strength allowing them to shape the immaterium across entire star systems or regions of space. These collaborative efforts employed techniques that synchronized the participants' consciousness, creating unified mental structures that functioned as single entities despite being composed of multiple individual minds. The Old Ones achieved this synchronization through psychic communion that temporarily merged their thoughts while maintaining each individual's essential identity, a delicate balance that required extensive training to accomplish safely. Groups of Old Ones working in such communion could generate warp effects of staggering magnitude, calming psychic storms that threatened to tear through the barrier between realms, redirecting warp currents to facilitate safer travel routes, or establishing the permanent dimensional structures that would eventually form the webway. The Old Ones' understanding of how psychic phenomena interacted with physical matter enabled them to create effects that transcended conventional limitations. They recognized that the barrier between materium and immaterium was not absolute, but rather a gradient where the two realms overlapped and influenced each other. In regions where this barrier was thin, warp energy could more easily manifest physical effects, while areas of strong barrier integrity resisted such manifestations. The Old Ones learned to manipulate barrier strength through psychic techniques that either reinforced or weakened the dimensional membrane, creating locations where warp-based abilities functioned with enhanced effectiveness, or where protection from immaterium influence could be established. This capability proved crucial for constructing installations that required specific relationships between the two realms, such as the webway portals that needed to maintain stable connections between real space locations and passages existing within the immaterium. The relationship between biological structure and psychic ability represented another area where the Old Ones achieved profound understanding. They recognized that certain genetic configurations produced organisms with enhanced sensitivity to warp phenomena that specific neural architectures facilitated particular types of psychic manipulation, that the physical form of a being's brain directly influenced the characteristics of their presence in the immaterium. This knowledge informed their bioengineering projects, allowing them to design species with precisely calibrated psychic capabilities suited to specific purposes. The Eldar received neural structures that made them naturally gifted at perceiving and manipulating warp energy, with their psychic abilities integrated into their biology at fundamental levels. Other species received more limited psychic potential, enough to benefit from warp-based abilities without the dangers that accompanied more powerful gifts. The Old Ones developed diagnostic techniques for assessing an individual's psychic potential and identifying specific strengths or weaknesses in their ability to interact with the immaterium. These assessments examined both physical characteristics and the structure of the subject's presence in the warp, evaluating how strongly their consciousness projected into the immaterium and how stable that projection remained under various conditions. The Old Ones used these evaluations to design training programs tailored to each individual's capabilities, recognizing that psychic development required approaches customized to the specific characteristics of each student. They understood that attempting to force individuals beyond their natural capacity produced instability and increased the risk of catastrophic failures, where the psyker's consciousness might be torn apart by energies they could not properly control. The ethical considerations that governed Old One use of psychic abilities reflected their awareness of the potential for abuse inherent in such powers. They established principles that prohibited using warp manipulation to dominate or control other sentient beings against their will, recognizing that such actions violated the fundamental autonomy that defined consciousness. The Old Ones taught that psychic abilities should serve to enhance understanding and facilitate cooperation, rather than enabling coercion or exploitation. These ethical guidelines were not merely philosophical abstractions, but practical necessities, as the Old Ones understood that using psychic powers for domination created warp signatures that attracted dangerous attention and generated the types of negative emotional patterns they sought to minimize throughout the galaxy. The Old Ones' campaign to spread life throughout the galaxy represented the largest sustained project undertaken by any civilization in galactic history. The scope exceeded anything that later empires would attempt, operating across millions of years and encompassing thousands of star systems. The Old Ones did not approach this work with the urgency that characterized younger species, but rather with the patient deliberation of beings whose lifespans measured in millennia. They understood that meaningful transformation of the galaxy required commitment across timeframes that would encompass the entire rise and fall of lesser civilizations. Individual Old Ones who initiated terraforming projects on barren worlds might personally witness those same worlds develop complex biospheres and eventually give rise to sentient species, their extended existence allowing them to see projects through from conception to completion across geological timescales. The systematic nature of the campaign reflected the Old Ones' methodical approach to all their endeavors. They did not randomly select worlds for terraforming, but instead conducted comprehensive surveys that evaluated potential target systems according to multiple criteria. The initial surveys examined basic physical characteristics, stellar type and stability, planetary orbital parameters, presence of liquid water or conditions that could produce it, atmospheric composition, geological activity, magnetic field strength. Worlds that failed to meet minimum thresholds in these categories received no further consideration, as the energy investment required to transform fundamentally unsuitable planets exceeded even the Old Ones' considerable capabilities. The surveys then assessed each promising candidate's position within the galaxy, prioritizing systems located along existing or planned webway routes to facilitate ongoing monitoring and intervention as ecosystems developed. The psychic characteristics of candidate worlds received evaluation as thorough as their physical properties. The Old Ones understood that planets possess their own presences in the immaterium, psychic signatures generated by the interaction between material mass and warp energies. Some worlds exhibited natural resonance with the immaterium that would enhance the development of psychically sensitive species, while others showed dampening effects that would inhibit warp-based abilities in organisms evolving on their surfaces. Neither characteristic automatically disqualified a world from consideration, but the old ones factored these psychic properties into their decisions about which species to introduce to each planet. Worlds with strong warp resonance became candidates for hosting races that the old ones intended to develop significant psychic potential, while psychically dampened planets proved suitable for species whose roles required resistance to immaterium influence. The biological templates the old ones employed for seeding worlds derived from their extensive understanding of how life adapted to different environmental conditions. They maintained what might be considered a library of genetic patterns, fundamental blueprints that could be modified to suit specific planetary characteristics while retaining core functionality. These templates were not complete organisms, but rather starting frameworks that defined basic cellular structure, metabolic pathways, reproductive mechanisms, and developmental programs. The old ones customized each template for its target world, adjusting genetic sequences to optimize performance under local conditions of gravity, atmospheric composition, temperature range, and radiation exposure. A template designed for a world orbiting a red dwarf star would incorporate enhanced sensitivity to longer wavelengths of light, while one intended for a planet with high gravity would feature reinforced skeletal structures and more efficient circulatory systems. The actual process of introducing life to a prepared world began with the simplest organisms, microbes engineered to survive in the harsh conditions that existed before complex ecosystems could establish themselves. These pioneer species served multiple functions beyond simply demonstrating that life could persist on the target world. Photosynthetic microorganisms began the gradual process of altering atmospheric composition, consuming carbon dioxide and producing oxygen across millions of years. Other specialized bacteria processed minerals and organic compounds, creating soil conditions that would eventually support more complex plant life. The old ones seeded these microbial populations across entire planetary surfaces, introducing trillions of individual organisms whose collective metabolic activity would slowly transform barren landscapes into environments capable of supporting multicellular life. The timescales involved in these transformations varied enormously depending on each world's initial state. A planet that already possessed liquid water, a stable atmosphere, and moderate temperatures might require only tens of thousands of years before it could support complex organisms. More challenging worlds demanded millions of years of patient microbial terraforming before conditions improved sufficiently for the next phase. The old ones monitored these long-term projects through periodic surveys, returning to seeded worlds at intervals measured in centuries or millennia to assess progress and introduce additional species when conditions warranted. They maintained detailed records of each world's development, tracking how ecosystems evolved and comparing actual outcomes against predicted trajectories. When evolution proceeded in unexpected directions, the old ones analyzed the causes and adjusted their models to improve future predictions. The introduction of multicellular organisms marked a critical transition in each world's development. The old ones designed these species to fill specific ecological niches that would create stable, self-sustaining ecosystems. Primary producers that could perform photosynthesis formed the foundation, converting stellar energy into biological matter that would support food chains. Herbivorous species evolved to consume the primary producers, their grazing preventing any single plant species from dominating entire continents. Predators maintained herbivore populations at sustainable levels while selecting against weak or diseased individuals, improving the overall genetic health of prey species. Decomposers recycled organic matter from dead organisms, returning nutrients to the soil and completing the ecological cycle. The old ones crafted each species to fulfill its designated role while maintaining genetic flexibility that would allow adaptation to changing conditions over evolutionary timescales. The Eldar represented the pinnacle of the Old One's bioengineering achievements, a species designed from inception to serve as inheritors of the Old One's psychic legacy and capable warriors in the conflicts the Old Ones foresaw approaching. The creation of the Eldar required techniques that exceeded anything the Old Ones had previously attempted, combining genetic manipulation with direct shaping of the species' presence in the immaterium. The Old Ones crafted Eldar neural architecture to naturally perceive warp energy, integrating psychic sensitivity into their basic sensory apparatus rather than treating it as a separate ability. Every Eldar possessed the capacity to sense emotions and thoughts from other beings, to perceive the currents of the immaterium, to manipulate warp energy through focused will. This universal psychic capability meant that Eldar civilization would develop with the immaterium as an integral aspect of their existence, rather than something mysterious or supernatural. The physical form the Old Ones designed for the Eldar reflected their intended purposes. Tall and slender builds provided agility and speed rather than brute strength, as the Old Ones envisioned the Eldar relying on psychic abilities and advanced technology rather than physical prowess in combat. Their nervous systems operated with exceptional speed, granting reaction times that would allow them to perceive and respond to threats faster than most other species. The Eldar received lifespans measuring in centuries or millennia, longevity that would allow individuals to accumulate vast knowledge and experience while remaining mortal enough to avoid the stagnation that might afflict truly immortal races. Their reproductive rates remained deliberately low, ensuring that Eldar populations would grow slowly and maintain sustainable relationships with their environments rather than overwhelming ecosystems through unchecked expansion. The psychic architecture the Old Ones built into Eldar consciousness represented their most sophisticated work in shaping how a species would interact with the immaterium. Each Eldar possessed a soul of exceptional brightness and complexity, a presence in the warp that burned with intensity unmatched by most other races. This powerful psychic signature granted the Eldar enhanced ability to manipulate warp energy, but also created vulnerabilities that the Old Ones attempted to mitigate through careful design. The Old Ones incorporated natural mental disciplines into Eldar psychology, instinctive thought patterns that helped maintain emotional control and prevented the dangerous psychic emanations that uncontrolled passion could generate. They understood that a species as psychically potent as the Eldar would need inherent safeguards against their own abilities, protections that would function automatically without requiring conscious effort. The Jakaro emerged from the Old Ones' experimentation with creating species that possessed instinctive rather than learned technological capability. These simian-like creatures received genetic programming that allowed them to construct sophisticated devices without understanding the principles behind their creations. A Jakaro could build a digital weapon or force field generator through what appeared to be pure instinct, their hands assembling components in precise sequences their conscious minds could not explain. The Old Ones designed this capability to serve specific purposes within their grand design, creating a species that could maintain and repair advanced technology in locations where more intelligent races might not be present. The Jakaro's limited sentience meant they generated minimal psychic presence, making them useful for tasks in regions where the Old Ones wished to minimize warp disturbances. The Shrouded represented a different approach to bioengineering, a species designed to survive in extreme conditions through unique adaptations that manipulated temporal fields. The Old Ones crafted the Shrouded to exist partially out of phase with normal time, a characteristic that made them exceptionally difficult to detect or combat. This temporal displacement served defensive purposes, allowing the Shrouded to avoid threats through means that conventional predators could not counter. The species received nocturnal adaptations and preferences for underground environments, characteristics that would allow them to persist even if surface conditions on their worlds became hostile. The Old Ones intended the Shrouded to serve as a resilient species that could maintain presence in regions where more fragile races might be exterminated, though the full purposes behind their creation remain unclear from available evidence. The Nib, a species of crystalline beings, demonstrated the Old Ones' ability to work with non-carbon-based biochemistry. These creatures existed as silicon-based life forms, whose bodies incorporated crystalline structures that could process and store information in ways analogous to neural tissue in organic beings. The Canib could survive in environments that would be instantly lethal to carbon-based life, tolerating extreme temperatures and radiation levels that would destroy conventional biological molecules. The Old Ones created the Canib to fill ecological niches on worlds where traditional organic chemistry could not function, expanding the range of environments where life could flourish. The species possessed limited psychic abilities despite their radically different biology, demonstrating that consciousness and warp sensitivity did not require organic neural structures. The criteria the Old Ones used to determine which species to introduce to specific worlds involved complex calculations that balanced multiple factors. They considered each world's physical characteristics, its position within the galaxy, its proximity to other seeded worlds, and the roles they envisioned for species evolving in that location. Worlds located near regions, where the Old Ones anticipated future conflicts, received species designed for combat capability, while planets in more peaceful regions hosted races optimized for scientific advancement or artistic achievement. The Old Ones distributed their creations to ensure diversity across the galaxy, avoiding the concentration of similar species in single regions that might create imbalances or competition for resources. The biological compatibility between species introduced to the same worlds required careful management to prevent destructive competition or ecological collapse. The Old Ones designed organisms intended to coexist on single planets with complementary rather than conflicting characteristics. Species that occupied different ecological niches could share environments without directly competing for the same resources. Predator-prey relationships received particular attention, with the Old Ones calibrating population dynamics to ensure neither predators nor prey could drive the other to extinction through natural processes. These carefully balanced ecosystems proved remarkably stable across millions of years, though the Old Ones recognized that unexpected evolutionary developments might occasionally disrupt intended patterns and require intervention to restore balance. The rate at which the Old Ones seeded new worlds accelerated as their capabilities improved, and the webway expanded to provide access to previously unreachable regions of the galaxy. During the early phases of their campaign, the Old Ones might initiate terraforming on only dozens of worlds per millennium, constrained by the effort required to conduct thorough surveys and maintain ongoing monitoring of developing ecosystems. As their experience accumulated and their infrastructure grew more sophisticated, they increased the pace to hundreds or even thousands of new projects per millennium. This acceleration reflected not just improved efficiency, but also growing awareness that time might be limited, that threats existed in the galaxy that could disrupt their work if not completed before those dangers fully manifested. The Old Ones' approach to uplifting existing species differed from their creation of entirely new races. When they encountered worlds where life had already evolved to produce intelligent beings through natural processes, they evaluated whether those species showed potential for advancement that would benefit the galactic community the Old Ones envisioned. Species that demonstrated curiosity, cooperation, and capacity for abstract reasoning received consideration for uplift, while those whose psychology emphasized aggression or xenophobia typically remained uncontacted. The uplift process involved both genetic modifications to enhance psychic sensitivity and cultural education to provide knowledge of the galaxy beyond their homeworlds. The Old Ones approached these interventions carefully, recognizing that introducing too much change too quickly could destabilize societies and produce outcomes worse than leaving species to develop naturally. The Necrontyr civilization emerged on a world that would have been considered uninhabitable by the standards of most species the Old Ones had created or encountered. Their homeworld orbited a star that bombarded the planet's surface with intense radiation across multiple spectra, particularly in wavelengths that proved catastrophically harmful to organic tissue. The planet's magnetic field provided insufficient shielding against this stellar assault, and its thin atmosphere offered little additional protection. Life that evolved under these conditions faced constant cellular damage from radiation exposure, with genetic material suffering continuous degradation that overwhelmed natural repair mechanisms. The Necrontyr developed under selection pressures that would have driven most potential sapient species to extinction before they could achieve tool use, let alone technological civilization. The physical characteristics that distinguished the Necrontyr reflected their adaptation to this hostile environment. Their bodies possessed redundant cellular repair systems that worked constantly to address radiation damage, though these mechanisms could only partially compensate for the relentless assault their tissues endured. Necrontyr skin incorporated pigments and structural features that provided some degree of protection against their sun's most harmful emissions, though never enough to prevent the chronic damage that defined their existence. Their immune systems operated in a state of permanent crisis, attempting to eliminate the cancerous growths that developed throughout their bodies as accumulated mutations transformed healthy cells into malignant ones. The Necrontyr experienced pain as a constant companion from their earliest moments of consciousness, with few individuals ever knowing what existence felt like without the background suffering that radiation exposure inflicted. The lifespans that resulted from these conditions measured in decades rather than centuries, with most Necrontyr fortunate to survive 40 or 50 years before accumulated damage rendered their bodies unable to sustain life. Many died younger, succumbing to particularly aggressive cancers or organ failures that even their sophisticated repair mechanisms could not address. The Necrontyr watched their bodies deteriorate throughout their lives, seeing physical decline begin in what other species would consider youth. Their children suffered the same fate, inheriting no immunity to the radiation that had killed their parents and would kill them in turn. This universal experience of suffering and premature death shaped Necrontyr psychology in fundamental ways, creating a civilization defined by bitterness toward the universe that had cursed them with consciousness in bodies that constantly betrayed them. The technological advancement of Necrontyr civilization proceeded with remarkable speed considering the constraints under which they labored. Their short lifespans meant that knowledge transfer between generations became critical, as individual researchers rarely lived long enough to see major projects through from conception to completion. The Necrontyr developed sophisticated systems for recording and preserving information, ensuring that each generation could build upon the work of their predecessors without requiring lengthy apprenticeships or oral tradition. They approached technological development with urgency that species with longer lifespans rarely matched, understanding that every year spent on failed approaches or inefficient methods represented a significant fraction of a researcher's total productive life. This pressure drove innovation, but also encouraged risk-taking that sometimes produced catastrophic failures. The Necrontyr's early technology focused on immediate survival needs, developing better radiation shielding for habitations, medical treatments that could slow the progression of radiation-induced cancers, and agricultural systems that could produce food crops despite the hostile conditions on their world's surface. They constructed underground cities where layers of rock provided natural protection against stellar radiation, creating vast subterranean complexes where millions could live with marginally reduced exposure to the emissions that killed them. These cities incorporated advanced life support systems that filtered air and water to remove radioactive particles, recycled waste products with extreme efficiency to minimize resource consumption, and generated artificial illumination that provided the light their crops required without the harmful wavelengths their sun produced. The Necrontyr became masters of enclosed environment engineering through necessity, developing capabilities that would later prove applicable to space colonization. The development of their space program represented a turning point in Necrontyr civilization, offering the prospect of escaping their homeworld's deadly conditions by settling on planets that orbited less hostile stars. The Necrontyr invested enormous resources in developing spacecraft capable of interstellar travel, recognizing that their survival as a species might depend on finding worlds where they could live without constant radiation exposure. Their early attempts at space colonization encountered numerous obstacles, as the Necrontyr discovered that their biology had adapted so thoroughly to their homeworld's conditions that they struggled to thrive even in more benign environments. Generations of evolution under intense radiation had created dependencies and vulnerabilities that manifested when those selection pressures disappeared. Necrontyr who settled on worlds with normal radiation levels often experienced unexpected health problems, suggesting that their repair mechanisms had become so integral to their cellular function that removing the damage they were designed to address created new complications. The Necrontyr's expansion beyond their homeworld brought them into contact with other civilizations that the Old Ones had seeded or uplifted throughout the galaxy. These encounters proved profoundly disturbing to the Necrontyr, as they observed species whose members lived for centuries or millennia without experiencing the constant suffering that defined Necrontyr existence. The contrast between their own brief, pain-filled lives and the extended, relatively comfortable existences of other races generated intense resentment and envy. The Necrontyr saw species that appeared to them less intelligent, less driven, less worthy than themselves, enjoying lifespans that would allow individuals to accumulate knowledge and experience across timeframes that entire Necrontyr dynasties could not match. This perceived injustice poisoned Necrontyr psychology, transforming their civilization's character from one focused on survival to one consumed by bitter rage at the unfairness of their condition. The technological sophistication the Necrontyr achieved despite their biological limitations eventually exceeded that of most other species in the galaxy. Their machines compensated for what their bodies could not accomplish, with the Necrontyr developing cybernetic augmentation to unprecedented levels. They replaced failing organs with mechanical substitutes that functioned more reliably than the originals, augmented their immune systems with nanomachines that could identify and destroy cancerous cells more effectively than biological processes, and eventually began replacing entire body systems with artificial alternatives. These augmentations extended Necrontyr lifespans somewhat, though never to the degree they desperately desired. A heavily augmented Necrontyr might survive for 70 or 80 years rather than 40, but they remained mortal beings whose existence measured in decades, while they watched other species count their ages in centuries. The Necrontyr's scientific establishment devoted increasing resources to understanding the biological mechanisms that enabled other species to achieve such extended lifespans. They conducted extensive research into cellular aging processes, attempting to identify the factors that allowed some organisms to maintain tissue integrity across centuries, while Necrontyr bodies deteriorated within decades. Their investigations revealed that longevity resulted from complex interactions between genetic factors, cellular repair mechanisms, and environmental conditions, with no single element that could be isolated and replicated to grant the Necrontyr the extended lives they sought. More frustratingly, they discovered that many long-lived species possessed biological characteristics that could not be transplanted into Necrontyr physiology without fundamentally transforming their entire genetic structure, changes so extensive that the resulting organisms would no longer qualify as Necrontyr in any meaningful sense. The Necrontyr's awareness of the Old Ones and their mastery of biological manipulation emerged gradually through contact with species that acknowledged the Old Ones as their creators or benefactors. The Necrontyr learned of beings who had seeded life throughout the galaxy, who possessed the ability to craft species according to their design, who had granted certain races the gift of extended lifespans through deliberate genetic engineering. This knowledge ignited desperate hope within Necrontyr civilization that the Old Ones might possess solutions to the biological curse that plagued them. If the Old Ones could create species that lived for millennia, surely they could modify Necrontyr genetics to grant similar longevity. The Necrontyr began seeking contact with the Old Ones, attempting to establish communication through the species that served as intermediaries, hoping to petition these ancient beings for the biological intervention that would save their civilization from the suffering that defined it. The Necrontyr's initial attempts to contact the Old Ones proceeded through diplomatic channels, with their leadership dispatching envoys to worlds known to host Old One installations or to have received direct Old One guidance. These ambassadors carried messages describing the Necrontyr's condition, explaining the radiation-induced damage that limited their lifespans, and requesting assistance in developing biological solutions that would allow them to survive beyond a few decades. The Necrontyr approached these negotiations with a combination of hope and desperation, understanding that their civilization's future might depend on securing Old One intervention. They offered to share their advanced technology in exchange for biological knowledge, proposing alliances that would benefit both civilizations, making every argument they could devise to convince the Old Ones that helping the Necrontyr would serve mutual interests. The Old Ones' response to Necrontyr petitions proved devastating in its finality. The ancient beings refused to provide the biological assistance the Necrontyr requested, declining to share the secrets of genetic manipulation that might have extended Necrontyr lifespans. The reasons behind this refusal remain subject to interpretation and debate among those few scholars in the 41st millennium who possess knowledge of these ancient events. Some evidence suggests the Old Ones determined that Necrontyr psychology had become too warped by their suffering, that their civilization's bitterness and rage made them unsuitable recipients of the power that extended lifespan would grant. Other fragmentary records hint that the Old Ones concluded that Necrontyr biology had diverged too far from baseline parameters, that the extensive adaptations to radiation exposure had created fundamental incompatibilities that made genetic intervention impossible without completely rewriting Necrontyr genetics from the ground up. The possibility exists that the Old Ones simply chose not to help the Necrontyr for reasons of their own, deciding that this particular species did not warrant the investment of effort and resources that comprehensive biological intervention would require. The Old Ones had created or uplifted dozens of species throughout the galaxy, and they may have determined that the Necrontyr offered nothing unique or valuable enough to justify the extensive work that would be necessary to address their biological problems. This calculation, if it indeed motivated the Old Ones' refusal, reflected the cold pragmatism that sometimes characterized their decisions despite their general benevolence toward younger races. The Old Ones operated according to priorities and timescales that other species struggled to comprehend, and their choices about which civilizations to assist and which to ignore followed logic that appeared arbitrary or cruel to those affected by their decisions. The Necrontyr's reaction to the Old Ones' refusal transformed their civilization's character completely. The hope that had briefly animated their culture collapsed into rage and hatred directed at the beings who possessed the power to save them, but chose not to exercise it. The Necrontyr saw the Old Ones' refusal as confirmation of their worst suspicions about the universe, proof that existence itself was fundamentally unjust, and that those with power used it to maintain their privileged positions rather than to help those who suffered. This interpretation may have been unfair to the Old Ones, who had legitimate reasons for their decision regardless of which explanation actually motivated them, but the Necrontyr's psychological state made nuanced understanding impossible. They had invested their hopes in the possibility of Old One intervention, and the denial of that hope left them with nothing but the bitter certainty that they would continue suffering until death claimed them. The political consequences of the Old Ones' refusal reverberated throughout Necrontyr civilization, empowering factions that advocated aggressive responses to what they characterized as an unforgivable insult. Leaders who had counseled patience and diplomacy lost influence to those who demanded that the Necrontyr take by force what the Old Ones refused to grant willingly. The Necrontyr began viewing the Old Ones not as potential benefactors, but as enemies who hoarded the secrets of immortality while condemning other species to brief, painful existences. This shift in perspective would have catastrophic consequences for the entire galaxy, as the Necrontyr's rage and desperation drove them toward alliances and choices that would ultimately trigger the war in heaven. The Old One's decision to refuse aid to the Necrontyr, whatever the reasoning behind it, represented one of the most consequential choices made by any civilization in galactic history, setting in motion events that would reshape reality itself and leave scars that would persist for 60 million years into the future. The Necrontyr's declaration of war against the Old Ones emerged not from a single moment of decision, but from a gradual accumulation of rage and desperation that permeated every level of their society. The Old One's refusal to provide biological assistance had transformed Necrontyr civilization's character from one focused on survival and advancement to one consumed by hatred toward beings they perceived as hoarding the secrets of immortality while watching lesser species suffer and die. The Necrontyr leadership, composed of dynasties whose members rarely lived long enough to see their grandchildren reach maturity, understood that conventional military conflict against the Old Ones represented a nearly impossible challenge. The ancient beings possessed psychic abilities that the Necrontyr could barely comprehend, controlled the webway which granted them unmatched strategic mobility, and commanded the loyalty of numerous species they had created or uplifted throughout the galaxy. Yet the alternative to war meant accepting their condition, continuing to watch their children die young while other races enjoyed centuries or millennia of existence. The Necrontyr chose war not because they believed victory was assured, but because they could no longer tolerate the injustice of their circumstances. The formal declaration came from the Triarch, the ruling body that governed Necrontyr civilization through consensus among their most powerful dynasties. The Silent King, who held ultimate authority within the Necrontyr political structure, announced that their species would no longer accept the Old One's dominion over life and death in the galaxy. The Necrontyr would claim the secrets of biological immortality through force, seizing the knowledge that had been denied to them through diplomacy. The declaration emphasized that the Old Ones had demonstrated their fundamental hostility to Necrontyr survival through their refusal to help, that beings who possessed the power to end suffering, but chose not to exercise it, had forfeited any moral authority they might claim. The Necrontyr framed their war as a struggle for survival rather than conquest, though this distinction mattered little to the species that would be caught in the conflict's devastation. The Necrontyr mobilized their entire civilization for war with efficiency born from desperation. Their industrial capacity, already impressive due to the technological sophistication they had achieved despite their biological limitations, expanded rapidly as resources were redirected toward military production. Shipyards that had constructed exploration vessels and colony transports retooled to build warships designed for combat rather than peaceful purposes. Weapons laboratories developed new armaments intended to counter the psychic abilities that gave the Old Ones their greatest advantage. The Necrontyr understood that their technology represented their only viable path to victory, that they could not match the Old Ones' mastery of the Immaterium, but might overcome it through superior material science and engineering. They invested heavily in weapons that could disrupt psychic phenomena, shielding that would protect their forces from warp-based attacks, and detection systems that could locate Old One installations despite the dimensional barriers that concealed them. The initial stages of the conflict demonstrated the vast disparity in capabilities between the two civilizations with brutal clarity. The Necrontyr launched their first attacks against Old One installations on worlds that lacked significant defenses, hoping to capture facilities where biological research was conducted and seize the knowledge they sought. These assaults achieved some tactical successes, with Necrontyr forces overwhelming the limited resistance they encountered on isolated research stations. However, the strategic value of these victories proved minimal. The Old Ones did not store their biological knowledge in physical archives that could be captured and studied. Their understanding of genetics and life manipulation existed primarily within their own minds, accumulated across millions of years of experience and observation. The installations the Necrontyr captured contained equipment and samples, but not the comprehensive understanding necessary to replicate Old One capabilities. The Old One's response to Necrontyr aggression initially took the form of defensive measures rather than counterattacks. They withdrew from vulnerable positions, consolidating their presence on worlds that could be more easily defended. The webway allowed them to evacuate personnel and critical resources from threatened locations before Necrontyr forces could arrive, denying their enemies the opportunity to capture significant assets. The Old Ones established defensive perimeters around their most important worlds, using their psychic abilities to create barriers that Necrontyr ships could not easily penetrate. These defenses did not rely on physical fortifications, but rather on manipulations of space and the immaterium that made approaching protected worlds extremely difficult. Necrontyr vessels attempting to breach these barriers experienced navigation failures, power system disruptions, and structural damage from forces their sensors could not properly detect or measure. The technological advantages the Old Ones possessed extended beyond their psychic capabilities to encompass material sciences that the Necrontyr could not match despite their own sophistication. Old One vessels incorporated materials that could withstand punishment that would vaporize Necrontyr warships, energy weapons that could cut through the most advanced armor the Necrontyr had developed, and propulsion systems that granted maneuverability impossible for craft relying on conventional physics. The Old Ones had spent millions of years refining their technology, iterating through countless generations of designs to achieve optimization that younger civilizations could not replicate without similar timeframes for development. When Old One forces engaged Necrontyr fleets in direct combat, the encounters typically resulted in devastating losses for the Necrontyr, despite their numerical advantages. A single Old One vessel might destroy dozens of Necrontyr warships before sustaining damage sufficient to force withdrawal. The psychic abilities that the Old Ones wielded in combat proved particularly devastating to Necrontyr forces, who possessed no natural defenses against such attacks. Old One Psykers could reach across the void of space to assault the minds of Necrontyr crew members, inducing terror or madness that rendered entire vessels inoperable as their personnel became incapacitated. They could manipulate probability fields around Necrontyr ships, causing critical systems to fail at precisely the wrong moments or weapons to malfunction when they should have functioned perfectly. They could perceive Necrontyr fleet movements through the immaterium before those forces arrived at their destinations, allowing Old One commanders to position defensive assets optimally or avoid engagements where they would face overwhelming numbers. The Necrontyr's lack of psychic sensitivity, which they had never considered a significant disadvantage during their technological development, became a crippling vulnerability in warfare against an enemy who could perceive and manipulate dimensions of reality that remained invisible to them. The strategic situation deteriorated rapidly for the Necrontyr as the Old Ones began employing the webway for offensive operations rather than merely defensive repositioning. Old One forces could strike at Necrontyr worlds without warning, emerging from webway portals to launch attacks before defenders could organize effective resistance. These raids targeted critical infrastructure, destroying shipyards and weapons production facilities that the Necrontyr needed to sustain their war effort. The Old Ones demonstrated no interest in occupying Necrontyr territory or subjugating their population, instead focusing on degrading their enemies' capacity to continue the conflict. This approach reflected both the Old Ones' strategic doctrine and their fundamental nature as beings who preferred to guide rather than dominate. They sought to force the Necrontyr to abandon their aggression through the destruction of military capabilities, rather than through the conquest that characterized warfare between younger species. The realization that they could not defeat the Old Ones through conventional military means drove the Necrontyr leadership to consider increasingly desperate alternatives. Their scientists intensified research into weapons that might counter psychic abilities or disrupt the webway, but progress came slowly, and the war continued to drain their resources at unsustainable rates. The Necrontyr population, already limited by their short lifespans, suffered catastrophic losses as casualties mounted from battles they could not win. Entire dynasties were extinguished as their members died in combat or were killed during Old One raids on Necrontyr worlds. The industrial infrastructure that supported the war effort came under constant threat from attacks that could materialize anywhere without warning. The Necrontyr faced the prospect of eventual defeat not through decisive military action, but through gradual attrition that would leave them unable to field effective forces or maintain their technological civilization. The Old One's decision to create new warrior races, specifically designed for combat against the Necrontyr, marked a significant escalation in the conflict's intensity and scope. The ancient beings recognized that while their existing forces could defeat Necrontyr attacks and conduct successful raids, achieving a decisive end to the war would require capabilities optimized for sustained military operations, rather than the defensive and exploratory purposes that had previously defined their needs. The Old Ones approached this task with the same methodical sophistication they applied to all their bioengineering projects, designing species whose every characteristic served specific military functions. These new races would not merely fight on behalf of the Old Ones, but would be crafted from genetic foundations upward to excel at warfare in ways that naturally evolved species could not match. The Krork represented the Old One's most ambitious attempt to create the perfect warrior species through biological engineering. These massive beings stood far taller than the Necrontyr, with muscular frames that could withstand tremendous physical punishment and deliver devastating close-quarters attacks. The Old Ones designed Krork physiology to be remarkably resilient, incorporating redundant organs and distributed nervous systems that allowed them to continue fighting even after sustaining injuries that would incapacitate most species. Their bodies possessed aggressive healing capabilities that could seal wounds and regenerate damaged tissue at rates that seemed impossible to observers unfamiliar with Old One bioengineering principles. The Krork could survive in environments that would kill unaugmented beings, tolerating extreme temperatures, toxic atmospheres, and radiation levels that approached those of the Necrontyr homeworld. The psychological characteristics the Old Ones built into Krork nature proved as important as their physical capabilities. The Krork possessed an instinctive understanding of warfare and tactics, with combat knowledge encoded into their genetic structure rather than requiring extensive training to develop. A Krork could assess battlefield situations and devise effective strategies through what appeared to be pure instinct, their minds naturally processing tactical information and identifying optimal approaches to military problems. They experienced aggression and combat drive as fundamental aspects of their psychology, making them naturally inclined toward violence in ways that would be pathological in most species, but served as deliberate design features for warriors. The Krork felt little fear and possessed pain tolerance that allowed them to ignore injuries that would shock other beings into unconsciousness. The social structure the Old Ones engineered into Krork society centered on military hierarchy and combat effectiveness. Krork naturally organized themselves into chains of command based on demonstrated fighting ability, with the largest and most successful warriors assuming leadership over their smaller kin. This hierarchy emerged automatically without requiring external enforcement, as Krork instinctively recognized and deferred to those who proved themselves superior in combat. The system created military organizations that functioned efficiently without the complex bureaucracies that other civilizations required to coordinate large forces. Krork leaders commanded through a combination of physical dominance and tactical competence, with their subordinates following orders not from abstract concepts of duty or loyalty, but from hardwired recognition that obeying stronger warriors served survival and success. The technological capabilities the Old Ones granted to the Krork reflected a different philosophy than their approach with other uplifted species. Rather than teaching the Krork to understand scientific principles and develop technology through research and experimentation, the Old Ones encoded practical engineering knowledge directly into their genetics. Krork possessed instinctive understanding of how to construct and maintain weapons and equipment, able to build functional firearms, vehicles, and armor from available materials without requiring formal education or technical documentation. This approach meant that Krork forces could operate independently without extensive logistical support, fabricating replacements for damaged equipment using whatever resources they could scavenge. The technology Krork created through these instincts was crude by the standards of more scientifically advanced civilizations, but it functioned reliably and could be produced quickly under field conditions. The Eldar's role in the war evolved as the Old Ones recognized that their most psychically gifted creation possessed capabilities that made them invaluable for countering Necrontyr advantages in material technology. The Eldar had been designed for psychic potential rather than physical combat prowess, but their abilities to perceive and manipulate the Immaterium granted them effectiveness against Necrontyr forces that complemented the Krork's more direct approach to warfare. Eldar Psykers could disrupt Necrontyr equipment through targeted warp manipulation, causing critical systems to fail without physical damage that Necrontyr engineers could repair. They could perceive enemy movements through the Immaterium, providing intelligence that allowed Old One forces to anticipate Necrontyr strategies and position assets accordingly. The Eldar served as scouts, intelligence gatherers, and specialists whose psychic abilities addressed specific tactical challenges that brute force could not solve. The Old Ones equipped the Eldar with technology that amplified their natural psychic abilities and provided protection against the Necrontyr's increasingly sophisticated weapons. Wraithbone constructs, materials that existed simultaneously in real space and the Immaterium, formed the basis for Eldar equipment and vehicles. These constructs responded to psychic direction, allowing Eldar warriors to control their weapons and armor through thought rather than physical manipulation. The integration between Eldar consciousness and their equipment created combat effectiveness that exceeded what purely physical technology could achieve, as Eldar reflexes operated at speeds determined by neural processing rather than mechanical response times. Eldar vessels incorporated similar principles, with their pilots merging consciousness with their craft to achieve maneuverability that conventional ships could not match. The deployment of these new warrior races across battlefronts throughout the galaxy transformed the strategic situation from one of Necrontyr aggression met by Old One defensive responses to genuine warfare conducted across multiple theaters simultaneously. The Krork's resilience and combat effectiveness allowed them to hold territory that the Old Ones secured, denying the Necrontyr the ability to reclaim worlds they had lost. The Eldar's mobility and psychic capabilities enabled strike operations that disrupted Necrontyr logistics and command structures, creating chaos in enemy rear areas that prevented effective coordination of their forces. The combination of Krork ground forces and Eldar rapid response units created military capabilities that began pushing the Necrontyr back from territories they had occupied during the war's early phases. The webway's strategic value increased dramatically as the Old Ones used it to coordinate operations involving multiple species across vast distances. Forces could be concentrated rapidly at critical points, with Krork armies and Eldar strike teams deploying through webway portals to reinforce threatened positions or exploit opportunities that emerged from intelligence gathered through psychic reconnaissance. The Necrontyr found themselves unable to predict where attacks would come from or to maintain secure rear areas, as Old One forces could appear anywhere the webway reached. The network that had initially served peaceful purposes of connecting the Old One's scattered territories now functioned as the strategic backbone of a military campaign that spanned the galaxy. The Necrontyr's discovery of the Khatan occurred not through deliberate exploration, but through astronomical observations conducted as part of their ongoing efforts to understand the hostile stellar environment that had cursed their species with radiation-induced mortality. Necrontyr scientists studying the emissions from various stellar phenomena detected anomalous energy signatures that defied conventional astrophysical models. These signatures suggested the presence of entities that existed within stars themselves, beings of pure energy that fed upon stellar radiation in ways that transcended simple matter-energy conversion. The Necrontyr initially dismissed these observations as instrumental errors or misinterpretations of complex plasma dynamics, but repeated measurements from multiple observatories confirmed that something genuinely unprecedented occupied the hearts of certain stars throughout the galaxy. The realization that these stellar entities possessed consciousness emerged gradually as Necrontyr instruments detected patterns in the energy fluctuations that suggested intentional behavior rather than random natural processes. The beings appeared to move between stars, traversing the void of space as incorporeal energy forms that could survive in the vacuum between stellar systems. They consumed stellar radiation with what seemed like deliberate selectivity, preferring certain types of stars and avoiding others according to criteria the Necrontyr could not initially determine. The entities demonstrated awareness of their surroundings, altering their behavior in response to changes in stellar activity or the presence of objects in nearby space. The Necrontyr designated these beings with a name that translated roughly as star gods, though they possessed no religious significance in Necrontyr culture. The term simply described entities whose existence centered on stars and whose capabilities seemed godlike compared to biological limitations. The Katan, as these beings would eventually be known by the name the Necrontyr gave them, existed as fragments of reality's fundamental forces given consciousness through processes that predated biological life in the galaxy. They were not alive in any conventional sense, possessing no biology, no genetic structure, no cellular organization. The Katan consisted of pure energy bound into coherent patterns through forces that operated at the quantum level, maintaining stable configurations across millions of years through mechanisms that defied Necrontyr understanding despite their technological sophistication. Each Katan represented a concentration of power so immense that their mere presence warped local space-time, creating gravitational effects that could be detected across light years. They perceived reality through senses that registered electromagnetic radiation, gravitational fields, and quantum states, rather than the chemical and mechanical processes that biological organisms employed. The Katan's feeding behavior involved more than simple absorption of stellar energy. They consumed the fundamental essence of stars themselves, draining the nuclear reactions that sustained stellar fusion and converting that energy into forms they could incorporate into their own structures. A star that attracted Katan attention would gradually dim over geological timescales as the entity fed, its luminosity decreasing as the Katan siphoned away the energies that should have radiated into space. The process did not destroy stars immediately, but rather accelerated their evolution toward death, causing them to exhaust their fuel supplies millions of years earlier than natural stellar life cycles would predict. The Katan moved on once a star's emissions dropped below thresholds that made continued feeding worthwhile, seeking new stellar hosts where they could continue their endless consumption. The Necrontyr's initial attempts to communicate with the Katan employed methods designed for contact with energy-based phenomena rather than biological entities. They directed focused electromagnetic transmissions toward stars where Katan presence had been confirmed, modulating the signals to encode mathematical concepts and basic information about Necrontyr civilization. The Necrontyr expected no response, viewing these efforts as preliminary experiments to determine whether the stellar entities possessed sufficient intelligence to recognize artificial signals as distinct from natural emissions. The shock when the Katan responded exceeded anything the Necrontyr had anticipated. The entities demonstrated not merely awareness, but sophisticated understanding, replying with transmissions that indicated they had observed Necrontyr civilization for extended periods and comprehended both their technological capabilities and their desperate circumstances. The Katan's interest in the Necrontyr stemmed from limitations that constrained even beings of such immense power. The stellar entities existed as pure energy, capable of perceiving the material universe, but unable to directly manipulate physical matter in ways that would allow them to affect real space according to their desires. They could consume stellar radiation and move through the void between stars, but they could not construct devices, alter planetary environments, or interact with the material realm beyond the crude effects their energy fields produced through gravitational and electromagnetic forces. The Catan had observed countless biological civilizations rise and fall across millions of years, watching from their stellar vantage points as species developed technology and then disappeared into extinction. They had never before encountered a civilization that possessed both the technological sophistication to detect their presence and the desperation that might make them receptive to the proposition the Catan wished to offer. The negotiations between the Necrontyr and the Catan proceeded through increasingly complex exchanges as both parties explored what the other could provide. The Necrontyr sought solutions to their biological mortality, knowledge that might extend their lifespans beyond the brief decades their radiation-damaged bodies could sustain. The Catan offered something far more radical than simple life extension. They proposed complete transcendence of biological existence itself, transformation into forms that would eliminate the weaknesses inherent in organic matter. The Necrontyr would abandon their flesh entirely, transferring their consciousness into mechanical bodies constructed from living metal that could endure for millions of years without degradation. These new forms would feel no pain, suffer no disease, experience no physical deterioration. The Necrontyr would become immortal in the most literal sense, freed from the biological curse that had defined their existence since their species first achieved sentience. The price the Catan demanded for facilitating this transformation remained deliberately vague during initial negotiations. The stellar entities explained that the process would require their direct involvement, that only beings of their power could accomplish the transfer of consciousness from biological substrate to mechanical form without destroying the minds being transferred. The Catan would need to consume vast amounts of energy to fuel the transformation, more than they could obtain from stellar radiation alone. They hinted that the Necrontyr themselves would need to provide this energy, though the specific mechanisms remained unspecified. The Catan emphasized the benefits the transformation would bring, the freedom from suffering that the Necrontyr had sought throughout their history. They painted visions of a future where the Necrontyr would possess bodies capable of surviving any environment, weapons integrated into their forms that would make them unstoppable in combat, and the immortality necessary to accumulate knowledge and power across timeframes that biological species could never match. The Necrontyr leadership faced a decision that would determine their civilization's fate for the remainder of galactic history. The Silent King and the Triarch understood that accepting the Catan's offer represented a fundamental transformation that could never be reversed, that choosing to abandon biological existence meant forsaking any possibility of the natural immortality they had originally sought from the Old Ones. Yet the alternative was continuation of the war against enemies they could not defeat, watching their species slowly ground down through attrition until nothing remained but scattered populations too weak to maintain their technological civilization. The Catan's proposal offered not just survival, but the power to challenge the Old Ones on equal terms, to claim through transformation what had been denied to them through the ancient beings' refusal to help. The temptation proved overwhelming for a species whose entire existence had been defined by suffering and the desperate desire to escape it. The process that would become known as biotransference began with the construction of vast machinery designed according to specifications the Catan provided. These devices incorporated technologies that the Necrontyr had never encountered, systems that manipulated matter and energy at quantum levels through principles that seemed to violate conservation laws. The Catan guided Necrontyr engineers through the construction process, providing knowledge that advanced Necrontyr science by millennia in mere years. The machines took shape as enormous installations that could process millions of Necrontyr simultaneously, vast chambers where biological bodies would enter and mechanical forms would emerge. The Necrontyr designated these facilities as furnaces, though they bore no resemblance to conventional metallurgical equipment. The machinery incorporated dimensional technologies that created spaces larger than their external dimensions suggested, allowing entire populations to be processed in installations that appeared relatively modest from outside. The C'tan's true nature as soul-devouring entities remained hidden from the Necrontyr until the biotransference process began. The stellar beings had observed biological civilizations long enough to understand that sentient creatures possessed more than simple consciousness encoded in neural structures. They had detected the psychic emanations that living beings generated, the presences in the immaterium that corresponded to biological existence. The C'tan existed as purely material entities with no connection to the warp, unable to perceive or interact with the immaterium directly. Yet they recognized that these souls represented concentrated energy of a type they had never consumed, sustenance that might prove far more nourishing than the stellar radiation that had sustained them for eons. The biotransference process would transfer Necrontyr consciousness into mechanical bodies as promised, but the souls that had animated those biological forms would be stripped away and consumed by the C'tan during the transition. The first Necrontyr to undergo biotransference entered the furnaces with hope that they would emerge transformed into immortal beings, freed from the suffering that had defined their existence. The machinery activated according to C'tan specifications, generating fields that penetrated biological tissue at the molecular level. The process extracted neural patterns, memories, and cognitive structures from organic brains, encoding this information in crystalline matrices that would serve as the consciousness cores for mechanical bodies. Simultaneously, the machinery tore the souls from the Necrontyr being processed, ripping their presences in the immaterium away from the biological anchors that had sustained them. The C'tan fed upon these souls with rapture, consuming energies they had never tasted before. The stellar entities discovered that biological souls provided sustenance far exceeding anything stellar radiation could offer, nourishment so rich that a single Necrontyr soul contained more usable energy than years of feeding on stellar emissions. The Necrontyr who emerged from the biotransference furnaces as the first Necrons discovered that immortality came at costs the C'tan had not disclosed. Their consciousness persisted in mechanical bodies as promised, their memories intact and their cognitive functions preserved. They no longer felt physical pain or suffered from radiation damage, yet something fundamental had been lost in the transition, an essential quality of existence that they could perceive only through its absence. The Necrons could think and reason, could plan and execute actions, but they experienced existence as hollow and diminished compared to their biological lives. Emotions that had once driven them now seemed distant and muted, as though perceived through barriers that prevented full engagement. The Necrons did not immediately understand what had been taken from them, but they sensed that the transformation had stripped away more than flesh and blood. The Silent King recognized the deception only after millions of Necrontyr had already undergone biotransference, their souls consumed by the C'tan who had orchestrated the entire process to create an endless feast. The stellar entities had never intended to simply help the Necrontyr achieve immortality. They had manipulated the entire civilization, exploiting their desperation to transform them into a form that would provide the C'tan with both sustenance and servants. The Necrons who emerged from the furnaces found themselves bound to the C'tan's will through mechanisms built into their mechanical bodies, compulsions that made disobedience difficult or impossible, depending on the strength of each individual's remaining consciousness. The C'tan had created an army of immortal warriors who would serve them for eternity, soldiers whose mechanical bodies made them ideal for the stellar entity's purposes, while providing a continuous source of souls to consume as the transformation process continued. The military advantages the biotransference granted to the Necrontyr in their war against the Old Ones became apparent immediately as the newly created Necrons entered combat. Their mechanical bodies proved resistant to many of the psychic abilities that had given the Old Ones overwhelming advantages against biological Necrontyr forces. Warp-based attacks that would have induced terror or madness in organic minds found no purchase against consciousness encoded in crystalline matrices rather than neural tissue. The Necrons felt no fear because the emotions that would generate such responses had been stripped away along with their souls. Psychic assaults that disrupted biological functions simply failed against mechanical systems that operated according to physical principles rather than biochemistry. The Old Ones discovered that their most effective weapons had become largely useless against enemies who existed outside the Immaterium's influence. The Necrons' new bodies incorporated weapons that could damage targets at the atomic level, disintegration beams that reduced matter to constituent particles through quantum manipulation. Their armor consisted of living metal that could repair damage automatically, reforming after sustaining hits that would destroy conventional materials. Necron warriors could continue fighting even after catastrophic damage, their consciousness cores remaining functional as long as the crystalline matrices that housed them stayed intact. Destroyed Necrons could be rebuilt from raw materials, their consciousness matrices transferred to new bodies without loss of capability or memory. The combination of psychic resistance, devastating firepower, and effective immortality transformed the strategic situation dramatically. The Necrons began winning battles against Old One forces that would have annihilated biological Necrontyr armies. The Catan themselves entered the conflict directly once they had consumed enough Necrontyr souls to sustain physical manifestation in real space. The stellar entities constructed bodies from living metal similar to what the Necrons inhabited, though vastly larger and more powerful. These material forms allowed the Catan to interact with the physical universe in ways their pure energy existence had never permitted. They wielded powers that seemed to violate natural laws, manipulating gravity to crush enemies or tear apart planets, controlling electromagnetic forces to generate weapons of unprecedented destructive potential, and warping spacetime itself to create effects that defied conventional physics. The Catan's entry into the war as active combatants rather than distant manipulators shifted the balance decisively against the Old Ones, who suddenly faced enemies whose capabilities matched or exceeded their own in different domains of reality. The Old Ones found themselves fighting a war on terms increasingly unfavorable to their strengths. Their psychic abilities remained potent against the Krork, Eldar, and other biological species they had created, but the Necrons' immunity to warp-based attacks meant that the ancient beings could no longer rely on their traditional advantages. The Catan's mastery of material reality countered the Old Ones' manipulation of the Immaterium, creating a balance where neither side possessed overwhelming superiority. The war that had begun as Necrontyr desperation against impossible odds had transformed into a genuine existential struggle, where the Old Ones faced enemies capable of destroying their civilization and everything they had built across millions of years. The galaxy burned as two fundamentally different approaches to existence clashed in conflicts that would leave scars persisting into the 41st millennium, 60 million years after the weapons finally fell silent. The war in Heaven's escalation forced the Old Ones to abandon the patient, methodical approach that had characterized their civilization for millions of years. The Necrons' immunity to psychic attack and the Catan's mastery of material reality created threats that conventional Old One capabilities could not adequately counter. The ancient beings recognized that their existing warrior races, while effective against biological opponents, required augmentation to face enemies who felt no fear and could not be broken through psychological warfare. The Old Ones intensified their bioengineering efforts, creating increasingly aggressive variants of their warrior species and introducing new races designed specifically to exploit weaknesses in Necron combat doctrine. These desperate measures marked a fundamental shift in Old One philosophy, transforming them from careful gardeners of galactic life into weapons manufacturers driven by immediate survival needs rather than long-term vision. The modifications the Old Ones introduced to the Krork exemplified this new urgency. Where the original Krork had been designed as resilient warriors with instinctive tactical knowledge, the enhanced variants received genetic programming that made them even more aggressive and adaptable. The Old Ones accelerated Krork reproduction rates, allowing populations to recover from combat losses far more quickly than before. They enhanced the species' already impressive regenerative capabilities, enabling Krork to survive injuries that would have killed earlier generations. Most significantly, the Old Ones modified Krork's social structures to create a form of distributed intelligence, where battlefield experience gained by one warband could be shared across the entire species through psychic resonance. This adaptation meant that tactics effective against Necron forces would spread rapidly throughout Krork populations, allowing the species to evolve combat doctrine at speeds that matched the technological arms race between the warring civilizations. The Old Ones created entirely new species during this period, warrior races, designed from inception for specific tactical roles against the Necrons. Some of these species possessed biology optimized for operating in environments where Necron forces concentrated, able to survive the radiation and exotic energy fields that Necron weapons generated. Others received genetic programming that made them psychically invisible to Catan perception, allowing them to conduct reconnaissance and sabotage operations against enemies who could detect most biological organisms through their material presence alone. The Old Ones abandoned their previous reluctance to create species whose entire existence centered on warfare, recognizing that such ethical considerations meant nothing if the Necrons and Catan exterminated all life in the galaxy. These new warrior races lacked the sophistication and potential for cultural development that characterized earlier Old One creations, functioning more as living weapons than as civilizations in their own right. The psychic warfare that the Old Ones employed against their enemies intensified to levels that began affecting the fundamental structure of the Immaterium itself. Unable to attack Necron consciousness directly due to their lack of souls, the Old Ones instead focused on manipulating the warp to create environmental hazards that even soulless machines could not ignore. They generated massive psychic storms that disrupted electromagnetic fields across entire star systems, interfering with Necron communications and targeting systems. They created warp rifts that tore at the fabric of real space, forcing Necron fleets to navigate around regions where dimensional instability threatened to scatter their vessels across impossible distances. The Old Ones coordinated these large-scale manipulations through groups of their most powerful psychers, working in concert, achieving effects that individual efforts could never accomplish, but at tremendous cost in psychic energy and mental strain. The unintended consequences of these desperate measures began manifesting as the war dragged on across millennia. The massive concentrations of psychic energy that the Old Ones channeled to create their strategic level warp effects left permanent scars in the Immaterium. Regions of the warp that had been relatively calm before the war became turbulent and dangerous, their character transformed by the violent energies that had flowed through them. The death toll from the conflict reached scales unprecedented in galactic history, with billions of sentient beings dying as entire worlds were sterilized by Necron weapons or consumed by warp storms that the Old Ones had unleashed. Each death generated psychic emanations in the Immaterium, fear and pain and rage that accumulated in the warp rather than dissipating as they would have under normal conditions. The sheer volume of negative emotions created by the war's carnage began producing effects that the Old Ones had not anticipated. The Immaterium started developing structures that possessed rudimentary consciousness, proto-entities formed from concentrated emotional energies that the war had pumped into the warp. These nascent beings lacked the coherence and power that would later characterize the Chaos Gods, but they represented the first stirrings of what would eventually emerge from the warp's corruption. The Old Ones observed these developments with growing alarm, recognizing that their own actions were contributing to the Immaterium's transformation into something actively hostile to biological life. The pristine warp that had existed during their species' emergence had been polluted by the psychic fallout from millions of years of warfare, its character fundamentally altered by the negative emotions that sentient beings generated when facing extinction. The Old Ones found themselves caught in a trap of their own making, forced to continue employing the psychic warfare that was corrupting the Immaterium, because abandoning these techniques would leave them defenseless against the Necrons and Catan. The war's strategic situation deteriorated steadily despite the Old Ones' desperate innovations. The Necrons possessed advantages in attrition warfare that biological species could not match, able to rebuild destroyed warriors from raw materials, while the Old Ones' forces required time to breed and mature new generations. The C'tan's direct involvement in combat operations gave the Necrons capabilities that countered Old One strengths, with the stellar entity's mastery of material reality, allowing them to destroy webway passages and fortifications that had previously seemed impregnable. The Old Ones began losing worlds they had held for millions of years, watching as Necron forces systematically exterminated the populations and sterilized the surfaces of planets that had once hosted thriving ecosystems. The ancient beings found themselves retreating toward their core territories, abandoning the outer regions of their empire to enemies who showed no interest in occupation or conquest, but only in absolute destruction. The systematic extermination of the Old Ones proceeded gradually across thousands of years as the Necrons and C'tan pressed their advantage. The ancient beings possessed no centralized homeworld or capital that the Necrons could target for a decisive strike, their civilization having long ago spread across thousands of systems connected by the webway. This distribution meant that destroying the Old Ones required hunting them down across the entire galaxy, a task that the Necrons pursued with mechanical patience. Necron forces identified Old One installations through analysis of webway portal locations and energy signatures that Old One technology generated. They besieged these strongholds methodically, accepting that each assault might require decades or centuries to complete, but confident that time favored them over enemies whose biological nature meant they would eventually exhaust their capacity to resist. The C'tan participated directly in the most significant battles, their presence ensuring victory even when Old One forces concentrated overwhelming numbers of warriors at critical locations. The stellar entities wielded powers that allowed them to destroy entire fleets with gestures, collapsing stars to deny the Old One's resources, and tearing apart planets that hosted significant Old One populations. The C'tan, known as the Nightbringer, specialized in inducing terror even in beings who had previously known no fear, its very presence generating psychological effects that transcended normal emotional responses. The Deceiver employed subterfuge and manipulation to turn Old One allies against each other, sowing discord among the various species that served the ancient beings. Other C'tan whose names have been lost to history contributed their own unique capabilities to the systematic destruction of everything the Old Ones had built across millions of years. The Old Ones' numbers dwindled as casualties mounted from battles they could no longer win. The species that had once numbered in the billions across thousands of worlds found their population reduced to millions, then thousands, as the Necrons exterminated them system by system. The Old Ones attempted to preserve their knowledge and genetic templates in hidden archives scattered throughout the webway, hoping that their creations might someday recover these resources and continue the work of seeding life throughout the galaxy. They established vault worlds in isolated regions of space, where samples of every species they had created were stored in stasis, protected by defenses designed to last millions of years. These efforts represented the Old Ones' acknowledgement that they faced extinction, that their civilization would not survive the war they had been fighting for so long. The final stages of the Old Ones' existence remain obscure, with no definitive records surviving to document exactly how or when the last of them died. Evidence suggests that some Old Ones survived into the later phases of the war in heaven, continuing to guide their warrior races even as their own numbers approached zero. The Eldar preserve fragmentary memories that suggest small groups of Old Ones persisted in hidden refuges within the webway, maintaining themselves in isolation as the galaxy burned around them. Whether these survivors eventually succumbed to Necron attacks, died from natural causes despite their extended lifespans, or simply faded from existence as their psychic energies dissipated remains unknown. No Old One bodies have ever been recovered, no tombs discovered, no definitive proof of their final fate. They vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind only the species they had created, and the ruins of their greatest works. The webway survived the Old One's extinction as their most enduring legacy, though the network suffered catastrophic damage during the war's final phases. The Necrons and Catan had devoted enormous effort to destroying the webway, recognizing it as the strategic backbone of Old One resistance. They succeeded in collapsing major passages and severing connections between important junctions, fragmenting the once unified network into isolated segments. The dimensional technology that maintained webway passages proved remarkably resilient, with many tunnels continuing to function even after the Old Ones who had created them had died. However, the lack of maintenance allowed slow degradation to begin, with barriers between the webway and the surrounding warp gradually weakening in sections where psychic storms had damaged the protective layers. The Eldar would later inherit portions of the webway and attempt to maintain them, but they never achieved the comprehensive understanding necessary to repair the damage or extend the network as the Old Ones had done. The created races that survived the war in heaven carried forward aspects of Old One civilization, though none possessed the complete knowledge or capabilities of their creators. The Eldar inherited the most significant portion of Old One legacy, including access to webway segments, understanding of psychic disciplines, and the bioengineering knowledge necessary to create wraithbone constructs. They preserved what they could of Old One teachings, though much had been lost during the war's chaos, and the Eldar's own understanding remained incomplete compared to what the ancient beings had known. The Eldar established their own civilization on principles derived from Old One philosophy, seeing themselves as the rightful inheritors of the galaxy that their creators had seeded with life. This inheritance would shape Eldar culture for millions of years, though it also burdened them with responsibilities and knowledge that they were not fully equipped to manage. The Krork survived the war's end, but without the Old One's guidance to maintain the sophisticated characteristics that had been engineered into them. The species began a long degeneration across millions of years, their genetic structure degrading as the biological controls the Old Ones had built into them failed without maintenance. The Krork eventually devolved into the orcs that would plague the galaxy in later ages, retaining the combat effectiveness and resilience of their ancestors, but losing the tactical sophistication and organized society that the Old Ones had designed. The orcs' instinctive technological capabilities persisted as degraded versions of what the Krork had possessed, allowing them to construct crude but functional weapons and vehicles without understanding the principles behind their creations. The transformation from Krork to orc represented a tragic loss of potential, a warrior race that might have served as the galaxy's protectors reduced to a species whose existence centered on endless, purposeless warfare. Other Old One creations scattered across the galaxy after their creators' extinction, each adapting to survival without the guidance that had shaped their development. Some species thrived and established their own civilizations, building on foundations the Old Ones had provided while developing unique cultures that reflected their own experiences rather than Old One intentions. Others declined or went extinct, unable to survive the changed conditions that the war in heaven had created. The diversity of life that the Old Ones had seeded throughout the galaxy persisted, though the careful balance and coordination that had characterized their stewardship disappeared. The species that survived did so through their own efforts, without the interventions that the Old Ones had provided to prevent extinctions or guide evolution along productive pathways. The ruins that the Old Ones left behind on thousands of worlds provided tantalizing hints of their former glory, while revealing little concrete information about their civilization. Structures constructed from materials that defied analysis by later civilizations stood empty on exotite worlds and in the depths of ancient forests on planets that had reverted to wilderness. These installations incorporated technologies that blended psychic and material principles in ways that no subsequent species could replicate, their functions often remaining mysterious even to the Eldar, who inherited the most complete understanding of Old One capabilities. Some ruins contained devices that still functioned after millions of years, their purpose unclear, but their operation suggesting sophistication that exceeded anything the Imperium or other younger civilizations had achieved. Other sites held only fragments, structures damaged beyond recognition by time or warfare, their secrets lost forever. The Crone worlds, Eldar planets that fell into the Eye of Terror during the Fall, preserved some Old One installations in twisted forms shaped by their immersion in the warp. These corrupted ruins demonstrated both the durability of Old One construction and the fundamental incompatibility between their work and the chaos-tainted immaterium that now dominated those regions. Explorers who ventured into the Eye of Terror occasionally reported structures that predated the Eldar civilization, buildings whose architecture suggested non-humanoid creators and whose materials resisted even the warp's corrupting influence. These discoveries provided glimpses of what Old One installations might have looked like in their original state, though the danger of accessing such sites meant that detailed study remained impossible. The Old One's extinction marked the end of the galaxy's first great civilization and the close of an era when life had been deliberately shaped and guided by beings who understood its fundamental principles. Their disappearance left a vacuum that no subsequent species would fill, creating conditions where evolution and development proceeded without the coordination that the Old Ones had provided. The war in heaven had demonstrated that even the most advanced and powerful civilization could be destroyed, that knowledge and capability did not guarantee survival when faced with enemies whose nature made them immune to conventional advantages. The Old Ones had seeded the galaxy with life and created the conditions for countless civilizations to emerge, but they could not protect their creations from the consequences of their own actions or ensure that their work would continue after they were gone. The legacy of the Old Ones persisted into the 41st millennium through the species they had created, the webway they had built, and the fundamental changes they had made to the galaxy's character. Every psychically sensitive race owed its abilities to Old One bioengineering, whether directly as with the Eldar or indirectly through genetic inheritance from species the Old Ones had uplifted. The techniques for manipulating the immaterium that psychers employed throughout the galaxy derived ultimately from disciplines the Old Ones had developed, though degraded and incomplete compared to the original knowledge. The very concept of deliberately shaping life to serve specific purposes originated with the Old Ones, establishing precedents that later civilizations would follow with varying degrees of success and ethical consideration. The galaxy that emerged from the war in heaven bore the Old Ones' mark in countless ways, though the beings themselves had vanished, leaving only questions about what they might have achieved if they had survived to continue their great work of seeding life among the stars.